a dead body on the side of the road.
You know if it's male or female?
It was very clear that she had been beaten up. She was involved in a very physical altercation.
Now we have to start running down the details.
Surveillance footage was really paramount in this investigation. Why did she need that money? Could she have gotten in trouble? She's gone, and now he's throwing things away right when he gets home. Something just didn't look right, and it raised our suspicion.
Where'd you go? I went straight home. Well, the camera doesn't lie.
Eileen Gowan is celebrating her birthday with her family.
Happy 60th birthday, Granny.
Happy birthday, Mom.
Happy birthday, Mom.
She didn't like getting older, that's for sure. But she still looked good for being 60.
Okay, let me get this food ready. I'm starving.
She was getting her buzz on cooking, just in her element in the kitchen. She was an awesome cook.
Can I help?
You can get me another beer.
Eileen and Sam were dating off and on for about a year and a half, maybe 2 years.
My mom was married 3 times. I believe she was a hopeless romantic, and she was always looking for that right person.
Cheers.
Cheers. She definitely wanted things to work with Sam. They seemed like they were having a pretty good day together. She just loved that we were all together. I just wish I would have done more. I wish I could have made it more special.
How can I help you, ma'am?
I need to report a missing person.
Nicole came into police records and reported her mother missing on the 14th of February, 2023. She last heard from her mother the morning of the 13th.
I spoke to her at like 8:30 in the morning, and she told me that Sam kicked her out and she had nowhere to go. There was arguing going on, and it wasn't good. So a friend of hers, Mike, offered to let her stay for a couple days. I didn't have Mike's number. I called Sam. He said he hasn't heard from her. It just was very odd to me. I was worried.
I'll get an officer to look at this.
So Nicole provided us with 2 names, Sam Brammer, Eileen's on-again, off-again boyfriend, and Mike Brockman, who she was currently living with. So we needed to speak with both of them. Right away on the 15th of February, we reached out to Sam Brammer and requested an interview with him. The missing persons case was initially assigned to Sergeant Ted Roberts.
I'm the sergeant that you talked to on the phone. My name's Ted Roberts. You know, Eileen, she's never done this kind of thing before. She's never just, took off and gone.
What she does is she comes to me, she's moved in with me 4 or 5 times. But usually when she moves in with me, she stays away from home.
He explains that they would be together, they would get in these arguments, and they would break up.
Sam tells detectives that Eileen messaged him on February 13th, the same day that Nicole last heard from her mom.
She texted me.
Okay.
And wanted to know if I would come and get her.
He said she needed to ride from Sugar's Diner to Mike Brockman's residence.
My mom was working at Sugar's in Council Bluffs as a server. She would come in at 5, 6 in the morning and clean it and then serve for the morning shift and then come back for her afternoon shift.
Sam says that he picked up Eileen in his 1999 Ford F-150 at 8:30 in the morning. They leave Sugar's Diner, and he takes her to Mike Brockman's residence.
I pull up, she gets in the truck. We take off and drops her off there, then I'm left.
It's about 2.5 miles from Sugar's Diner. He would have dropped her off there at about 8:40 in the morning.
Sam indicated that he had not heard from her again.
When Sam mentions that, it certainly makes us want to talk to Mike sooner than later.
Detectives bring in Mike Brockman for questioning.
Detective Brannigan, this is Sergeant Roberts. Thanks for coming in today.
Law enforcement wants to know when was the last time Mike Brockman saw Eileen? How did that relationship work or go?
Tell me how you met Eileen.
Mike said he's a regular patron of Sugar's Diner. He knows Eileen from frequenting that business. We asked him if he had any type of contact with Eileen.
Was there ever anything sexual between you and Eileen?
He flat out denied that. He said he had no desire to have an intimate relationship with her.
Why was Eileen staying at your place?
He allowed her to stay on this couch and stay there for a short period of time. On Sunday night, had a conversation with her that that was going to be her last night. She needed to find another place to stay. And he would take her to work that morning on the 13th, Monday morning, and he would come pick her up, gather her things, and he would take her wherever she wanted to go.
What time did you drop Eileen off at Sugar's Diner Monday morning?
He said he dropped her off at about 5 in the morning.
Thanks, Mike.
And he says he worked all day. He arrives home around 5 o'clock in the evening, so he waits until about 8 p.m. He still hasn't heard from Eileen.
What did you do then?
So he gathers up Eileen's belongings. He drives to Sugar's himself and drops them off.
Mike's account is directly contradicted by Sam's interview that he picked up Eileen and he drove her straight out to Mike Brockman's house.
Both Sam and Mike are released, pending further investigation.
Police are now trying to verify the stories that they've received from Sam and from Mike. First thing they do is start looking for video. So they reach out to Sugar's.
Morning. I'm Sergeant Roberts. This is Detective Brannigan.
Morning.
We'd like to ask you some questions.
That morning, Eileen came in early. She did her cleaning, then she left at 8:30 in the morning.
Was there anything odd or unusual about Eileen's mood or behavior?
She was supposed to be back at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and she didn't show up. It was completely out of the ordinary.
Do you have any surveillance cameras on the premises?
Sugar's Diner has a camera out the back door, has a camera at the front, at the entrance. What we're hoping to see is Eileen come to work and how she's acting. We want to make sure that she's, first off, acting normal.
Can you start just before 8:30 a.m. on the backdoor camera? Stop.
There's Eileen.
We see Eileen walking across the video screen. She leaves work. She doesn't look like she's in any type of distress.
Okay, keep playing.
They're really hoping that, as that camera advances, that they'll be able to see what happens next, where she goes, who she's with. Sam indicated that he was driving her out, and he had a fairly distinctive truck. He had a Ford F-150.
Rewind and play that again.
It's Brammer.
We see Sam's truck drive directly in front of that camera angle.
Play that again. Stop. Zoom in.
We can clearly see Eileen sitting in the passenger seat of that truck. So that confirms the statement from Sam that he did pick her up that morning at 8:30, and she was healthy, alive, and with him voluntarily.
It's time to start trying to verify Mike Brockman's story. He had indicated that he had dropped Eileen's belongings off that evening at the back door of Sugar's.
Show me the camera that covers the back. Play just before 8 p.m. Stop there.
We can clearly see Mike Brockman removing some items from his truck and leaving them at the back door. And then he gets back in his truck and he drives off. So he was telling us the truth. Now we know that at 8:30 in the morning that she's alive and well in the passenger seat of Sam Brammer's truck. At about 8 o'clock at night, Mike Brockman is dropping off her belongings at the back door. So we need to be able to put more things into that timeline. We need to know where she was at what time, who she was with, what she was doing. We don't have any of this information yet.
See, now police have to start running down the details. Does Mike Brockman have an alibi for his whereabouts on the day of February 13th? And so detectives went to his work.
The manager pulled up his timesheets on the morning of the 13th. He clocks in at around 6 o'clock in the morning. Mike Brockman was still there talking with coworkers when she left. Around 4 o'clock, Mike Brockman was at work all day long on the 13th, just like he told us.
Mike has a pretty solid alibi. So Sam Brammer was the last one that has been seen with her at 8:30 in the morning.
The investigators switch gears.
The police are trying to find out who has spoken with Eileen, who has seen Eileen after Sam had picked her up from Sugars. So they reach out to friends and family, and they end up speaking with Eileen's mom, Kathleen, at Dudley Court Apartments.
Kathleen tells detectives that Eileen visited her at around 8:45 a.m.
How was Eileen when you saw her on February 13th?
Kathleen said that she was acting completely normal.
What did Eileen do when she came in?
Kathleen said that she went into the apartment, went straight into the bedroom where the safe is kept, retrieved the safe, and she left the apartment. That safe had about $1,200 into it, according to her mom. That's a pretty good, sizable amount of money.
Eileen's visit to her mom's apartment conflicts with Sam's account of her movements that morning.
Sam's interview indicated that he picked up Eileen at Sugars at 8:32, and he drove her straight out to Mike Brockman's house. He lived north and east of Sugars, about 5-10 minutes away. Eileen's mom's apartment is around 15 minutes west of Sugars. And if he drove her straight out to Mike Brockman's house, then she couldn't be at her mom's apartment at about 8:45 a.m., 10 minutes later. So law enforcement is looking to try to verify, again, the accuracy of the statements. They're able to acquire the surveillance footage from the Dudley Court Apartments.
Okay, start just before 8:40 a.m.
So at about 8:45 in the morning, we see Eileen enter Dudley Court. She comes in through the foyer. She gets on the elevator.
Next camera.
And then we see her come off the elevator on the second floor. And she walks directly to her mom's apartment.
Then she goes off camera. And then about 5 minutes later, you can see her coming out.
She's carrying the safe.
It was a small black safe with a handle on top. Why did she need that money? Did she need to just get away from everything for a little while? Or could she have gotten in trouble? Did she need to pay somebody off?
Back to the lobby camera.
She exits out of the lobby.
Unfortunately, there's no cameras that cover where she goes once she leaves. She's not seen with Sam Brammer, but he's the one that left Sugars with her. And 15 minutes later, she's on camera at Dudley Court Apartments. So this is certainly pretty good evidence that she is still with Sam Brammer during this period of time.
Across town, Eileen's family struggles with her disappearance.
As time went, we became more and more concerned.
My brother Jack made a missing person flyer.
And we all went, every gas station, every bar, I mean, just every business that would let us put it up.
Hey there, it's Eileen Gowan. Leave a message.
I was calling her, blowing her phone up, no response. My mom was my best friend. And so I knew I had to stay strong for the girls, but believe me, there was times that I couldn't.
Investigators refocus on Sam's movements on February 13th. They review the data from traffic cameras to trace where he went that day.
Sam told us that he picks her up at 8:30, took her to Mike Brockman's house, and he went back home.
There are a couple of surveillance cameras that were positioned between Sugar's and Mike Brockman's house that captured the highway. Sam's truck is not captured on that video. But Sam's truck is identified at 9:28 a.m. on the 13th, heading westbound on West Broadway at about 36th Street, which would be leading into Omaha, Nebraska. Still not in the direction of Mike's house, which is north and east of town.
The next surveillance camera photograph we receive is Sam returning, now traveling eastbound at the same location at 10:28 a.m., 1 hour later. So for 1 hour, he's somewhere in Nebraska. There is someone in the passenger side, but you can't see the passenger's face. Something just didn't look right, and it raised our suspicion.
Investigators invite Sam to the police department for a second interview.
We began talking with him again about his movements that day. Now this time, he knows that we have some questions. He's prepared, and he gives us a little bit more information.
So I went and picked her up, and she got in the truck, but she didn't want to go home right away. So me and her just went right down Broadway, and then she wanted to stop at her mom's house.
He tells us, well, I didn't take her straight to Mike Brockman's house. First, she needed to go see her mom. So we went to Dudley Court.
I stopped at her mom's house, and she was in there for, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes. She come out of there, got back in. She just said she wanted to talk to her mom. That's what she told me.
Did she come out with anything? Did she have anything?
She had her purse, and she had a black safe with her. She wanted to talk to me about helping her get in the apartment.
Now we know what that money was for. That money was to put down on an apartment, the deposit, first month's rent. We received video photos from Sherwood Apartments and located them walking up to the door, seeing that the office doors were closed, and then they left.
That confirms that part of his story, but he still ends up with the story that he drops her off at Mike Brockman's house.
Okay, and it's somewhere off of there is where you drop her off.
As soon as I pulled up, and she didn't want me to go in the driveway in case he was there. And that's when I went straight, turned around, and came back.
Okay.
And I hit straight home.
We know that he didn't take her to Mike Brockman's house because we have the video of him going back west.
We have a camera at 36th and Broadway, and we have your truck going westbound at 9:28 a.m. going to Omaha.
I told you, I went straight home. I don't remember going to Omaha.
Well, the camera doesn't lie. And then 1 hour later, you're coming back from Omaha, and you're going eastbound, coming back into Council Bluffs. 1 hour later. Where'd you go?
I went straight home.
I know that he's not telling me the truth. I don't know why he's lying to me yet, but there's a lot of things that just aren't adding up.
We'd like to look a little bit further in your phone and get the location information off of it so that we can see where you went during that time. Okay?
We applied for search warrants for Sam and Eileen's phone. We can find out the movements of their phones.
While investigators wait for the phone data, they review the surveillance footage from the apartments where Sam lives.
Play the camera that faces the parking lot.
That's Sam's truck.
This camera angle shows Sam Brammer arriving home at 12:59 on the 13th, the day that Eileen went missing. He gets out, fiddles around with his truck. Sam takes some things out of the truck and walks away.
What's he got in the bag?
Is there a camera that shows where Sam goes?
Right at the entrance is a dumpster. We can see Sam, and he walks toward that dumpster, carrying whatever it is that he's carrying.
What's he throwing in the trash?
It's hard to tell. Go back to the first camera.
He returns to his truck. He's opening up the doors. He looks like he's cleaning a couple of things out.
Why is he spending so much time in the passenger side?
That door was open. There's a tree there. It's hard to see exactly what he's doing. Then he closes up the truck and walks back to his apartment. We can clearly see that Eileen's not in the truck at this time. She's gone, and now he's throwing things away right when he gets home. That raises some red flags with me.
By the time we realized that footage existed, it was too late to find out what he'd put in the dumpster. That dumpster had already been emptied.
Okay, let's just keep watching and see if Sam comes back out to his truck.
The surveillance camera on the 14th shows him leaving in his truck after dark, about 8 p.m.
Fast forward, let's see when he comes back.
He returns at about 10 p.m., so he's gone for about 2 hours. We need to know where Sam went. So we still have some unresolved questions that we would like to talk with him about. We had tried to contact him, leaving messages, but we didn't get any response.
Investigators issue a bolo for Sam and his pickup.
You can light it up. It's approaching him.
A patrol officer spots the truck in Council Bluffs later that afternoon.
Sam is obviously beginning to elude. He speeds up. It's a dangerous pursuit. He's driving recklessly. There's traffic. The speeds are getting pretty high. He's running stop signs. So it's determined that this pursuit needs to end.
A warrant is obtained for Sam's arrest for eluding.
Three days later, Sam Brammer turns up at the police department.
I'm Sam Brammer. I got outstanding warrants. I'm here to give myself up.
I drove straight to the station and prepared to talk to him.
Detective Brannigan questions Sam for a third time about his movements on the day that Eileen disappeared.
I'm trying to really lock him into a final route that he took.
Where did you go between 9:28 and 10:28 with Eileen?
He now admits to having new memories. He now remembers that they did actually travel over across to Omaha.
He said they went to Carter Lake, to the park, which is actually in Omaha. And he said that they fooled around a little bit. So that was his reason for being in Omaha for an hour.
And where did you go then?
I dropped her off at Mike's place. Look, if you don't believe me, I can show you the route we took.
And I thought, you know, that's a great idea. Let's do that. We turned up 205th Street, and 205th is where Mike Brockman lives. He says, this right here is where I turned around. She got out, grabbed her purse, grabbed her safe, and she just stood there as I drove away. So he's able to claim at that point he has no idea where she went because he last saw her standing on the side of 205th Street between two homes. I absolutely know he's lying at that point. He never made it there. He never went to 205th Street. So we drive back to his apartment. I pulled up right behind his truck, and I asked him, Sam, do you mind if we take a look in your truck? He says, you're not going to find anything, he said. We just want to look and see if there's anything in there that tells us that there was a disturbance between you and Eileen inside that truck. So, Detective Fletcher looked inside the vehicle. He didn't see anything completely out of the ordinary. Sam Brammer knew now that we were definitely interested in this truck. We wanted to see inside that truck. But at this point, we only have a missing person. We don't have a crime. So I don't have probable cause to seize or search anything.
Sam is taken back to the station and released on bail for his traffic violations. Investigators refocus on tracing Sam's movements on February 13th, the day Eileen disappeared.
When Sam comes back from Omaha, the traffic camera captures his truck at 10:28, but we didn't know where he went after that. So I requested a couple of our detectives to go canvass every business in that area for any kind of video footage that they could find, and they did just that. We were able to secure video from one of the businesses in this area. It's a Burger King in the 3200 block of West Broadway, right by the traffic camera at 36th and Broadway.
Play from there.
We can see Sam Brammer's truck pull up to the drive-thru.
Okay, rewind. Let's have another look.
It captures both him and Eileen in the passenger side. We know it's Eileen, but the way she's positioned is very awkward. It's strange.
Zoom into Eileen.
It looks like her right arm has crossed her body. She doesn't look right, and all you can see is her lower body. And nothing moves. The whole time that he's sitting there, nothing moves. We watched it several times. I never thought that I would ever see a piece of video footage like this. We started noticing Brammer.
Look at his chest. It's really moving up and down.
He was taking very large breaths. He was gasping. You could see the nervousness on Brammer. After that, we were convinced that Eileen was either hurt very bad and unconscious or already deceased. And then we received a phone call.
911, what's the address of your emergency?
Crescent, Iowa.
What's going on?
So we were driving down the road, and there is a dead body on the side of the road.
Do you know if it's male or female?
It's female for sure.
On February 26th, a 911 call came in alerting authorities to a body that had been located. I was the on-call supervisor that day, and so that's why I was dispatched to it. I could see that the body was on the side of the roadway in the ditch. The body had jeans on and a coat with a zipper, and I was aware of the clothing that Eileen had last been seen in. So it was pretty apparent that that was her.
Detective, you seen a black safe box?
Nope.
The safe wasn't anywhere in the area. She was missing her glasses. One of her shoes was missing. Her purse was not in the area. Her phone wasn't around her.
When could she have been dumped here?
It had snowed several days before, and so the snow had begun to melt. That's when the body was able to be seen
We could see that there really wasn't snow underneath the body, which suggested that she had been there prior to when it snowed, since roughly the 13th, the day she went missing. There was a laceration on the top of her head, and there was also a ligature mark on her neck that we noted.
The number of contusions and injuries that Eileen sustained, it was very clear that she had been beaten up. She was involved in a very physical altercation. Now my investigation ramps up. Now we absolutely have a homicide.
Investigators contact Eileen's family with the news.
Detective Brannigan just said, "I'm sorry to inform you, but it was your mom's body that we found." I just lost it.
That little sliver of hope is, of course, gone then. You don't ever think that something like this is going to happen to someone you know.
I couldn't tell my daughter that the person she loved so much is never coming back.
I felt between helpless and hopeless. My focus was they better get him before I do.
Detectives secure a warrant to search Sam's apartment and his pickup truck.
The truck wasn't there that night. We had announced ourselves, entered. Sam was inside the residence. He didn't want to talk to us.
Put Sam on the stairs and search the apartment.
Sam shares that apartment with his granddaughter, Emily. We asked Emily what happened to her grandpa's truck.
My grandpa told me to tell anybody who asks about the truck and where it is. He told me to say, "I don't know." That's all he told me to say, was, "I don't know where it is." I told the police officer that a few days prior, my grandpa asked me if I could follow him in his truck to the scrapyard in Carter Lake. He pulled his truck in to go get crushed.
We received the still photos from Lakeside Auto Salvage. We can clearly see his truck, his driver's license, and him in his truck. He had the car shredded.
Our belief was that there would have been incriminating forensic evidence in that truck. He was able to get that truck crushed before we were able to get it searched.
We missed that opportunity. It just makes you shake your head. It's unbelievable. What else could happen?
Detectives received Sam's and Eileen's cell phone data from February 13th.
We were able to triangulate their locations with cell towers. The information that we received shows the phones traveling together up until about 11 o'clock in the morning. And right about that time, the phones are no longer communicating, which means they were either turned off or they were placed on airplane mode.
Investigators search for surveillance cameras close to the location of the last ping from Eileen's phone.
We were able to find some surveillance video from a Department of Transportation camera out in Trainer, Iowa, on Highway 92.
At 11:46 a.m. on February 13th, a camera captures Sam Brammer's pickup.
Sam's truck is seen traveling east on Highway 92 through Trainer, Iowa. And he drives out of sight, continuing east. And at 12:34, we again see Sam's truck, this time traveling on Highway 92 back toward Council Bluffs. Now we can clearly see through his windshield as he's driving. He's the only person inside that truck. But Eileen's phone is with him. Sam continues all the way to his home. When he gets home at 12:59, we know Eileen is not in that truck because he has it all opened up. I believe that Sam dumped her somewhere east of Trainer. Just to get her out of his truck, he needed to find someplace to hide her quickly.
The next day, we know he's gone for 2 hours on the 14th, as we see the surveillance video showing him leaving the apartment complex about 8 p.m. and returning at 10 p.m. That would have been plenty of time for him to drive, retrieve her body, take her to the different location, and drop her body on Mormon Bridge Road. Law enforcement is really, looking at motive at this point. So we obtained Sam's bank records.
I came upon one deposit that occurred on the 15th of February. This was a deposit of $1,200 in cash. This amount of money matches the amount of money that should have been in the safe that Eileen had. Video from the bank does show Sam Brammer enter the bank and give cash to the teller.
This was very significant because Eileen has the safe that has $1,200 cash in it that has gone missing, and then 2 days later, he's showing up at the bank depositing, coincidentally, $1,200 in cash. He had taken possession of her safe.
So at this point, we had enough probable cause to issue warrants for Sam Brammer's arrest.
On May 24th, Sam Brammer is arrested.
He was formally charged in August of 2023 with second-degree murder. And then the trial began in mid-November.
Prosecutors lay out the events that led to Eileen's murder.
Sam picked her up at Sugar's at 8:32. He drove her to her mom's apartment where she retrieved the safe. Then they started heading westbound through the city of Council Bluffs, across to Omaha. They drove to Carter Lake.
Oh, no. Come on. Come on, jump out. It's a beautiful day. Come on. No. Yeah. Come here. Come on. Hey, come here, Sam. Ooh. Stop.
I posited to the jury that he's assaulting her with something more than his fist, something significant enough to cause a laceration to the left side of her scalp. He brutally assaulted her while he was choking her, and during that assault, she died. He then puts her back in the truck and heads back into Council Bluffs. At 10:36 a.m., she can be seen now awkwardly slumped in the drive-thru at Burger King. We have cell phone data and the surveillance video that showed that he was heading east toward Traynor, where he dumped her body. Shortly thereafter, he's heading back westbound, back into Council Bluffs, without Eileen. And then he arrives back home, the Cottonwood Apartments. He grabs something from the bed of the truck, and we see him walk across and deposit that item in the dumpster. The next day, he's leaving the apartment complex about 8 p.m. to collect her body from maybe where it had initially been dumped to where it ultimately ends up north of town at Mormon Bridge Road and 152nd. Then Sam Brammer deposited $1,200 cash, probably taken from her safe. On January 18th, 2024, the judge sentenced Sam Brammer to the maximum of 65 years in prison for murder in the second degree, abuse of a corpse, and theft in the second degree. Mike Brockman was cleared of any wrongdoing whatsoever.
Surveillance footage was really paramount in this investigation.
Even though the crime itself was not captured on video, almost the entire before and almost the entire after was captured on surveillance video.
Without the cameras, we would have possibly never solved this crime.
It was partial release when we found out that he was guilty. But then the other part of it is it didn't bring Mom back. So I would give anything to talk to my mom one more time.
I just miss her big personality, and it's infuriating that someone could take that for no good reason. I would just choose to remember her as somebody who was always willing and able to do her best for her kids and her grandkids.
She was funny. She loved life. She had this weird laugh that was contagious. She was just a great person. Whenever I needed her, whether it was in the middle of the night or she had something going on, she would stop what she's doing and come to be with me. Just anything. She was there. I love and miss her very much.
Next time on See No Evil.
911, yes, address of your emergency.
Cause of death had been ruled a homicide. They said it was very clear strangulation.
I noticed several cameras. We see the suspect. We need to find out who he is. I want to get this person off the streets immediately.
For 37 years, nobody knew her name. She was found beside a lonely Ohio road, dead, barefoot, and wearing a distinctive buckskin jacket that would eventually become the only name the public knew her by. The newspapers called her the Buckskin Girl. Investigators called her Miami County Jane Doe. Somewhere, there was a family who had once known her as a daughter. Somewhere, there were people who remembered her face, her voice, the way she walked, the things she loved, the places she had been. But in Troy, Ohio, on that April morning in 1981, none of those people were there. There was only a body beside Greenlee Road, a terrible mystery, and a question that would survive for decades. Who was she? And who had killed her? The answer to the first question would eventually come through one of the most remarkable uses of genetic genealogy in a cold case. The second question remains unanswered, and that is what makes the story of Marcia King so haunting, because identifying the victim did not end the mystery. It revealed just how much of the mystery was still waiting in the darkness. It began on April 24, 1981, when 3 passers-by discovered the body of a young woman along a rural roadway near Troy in Miami County, Ohio. The location was isolated enough to conceal a terrible secret, yet close enough to major transportation routes that investigators immediately considered the possibility that the woman had been killed somewhere else and brought there. Interstate 75 was only a few miles away. The road could provide an offender with something every killer wants after a crime: distance, privacy, and a quick route away. But the woman herself seemed to have arrived without a path. There were no identification documents that could immediately tell police who she was. No missing person report produced an answer. Her fingerprints did not match records in the systems available to investigators. Dental information produced nothing. She had become a Jane Doe in the most literal sense, a woman whose life existed somewhere beyond the crime scene but whose identity had vanished at the exact moment investigators needed it most. What they did know was terrifying. She had been murdered. Authorities determined that she had died from strangulation and blunt force trauma. She had been fully clothed except for her shoes. Her bare feet were remarkably clean, a detail that would later contribute to investigators' belief that she had not walked to the location where she was found. It looked increasingly like she had been killed elsewhere and then left beside the road. But who had transported her? From where? And why this particular location? Those questions immediately became the center of an investigation that would eventually stretch across generations. Police did what investigators have always done when a victim cannot speak for herself. They searched for anything that could identify her. They examined her clothing. They studied her physical characteristics. They created a composite image of her face and distributed it through newspapers and television. The public was asked to look at the image and ask themselves a simple question: have you seen this woman? The response was enormous. Approximately 200 leads came in. Every lead had to be examined. Every possible identification had to be checked. Every missing woman who seemed remotely similar had to be considered. But one by one, the possibilities collapsed. Nobody could give her a name. The most recognizable item associated with her became the buckskin jacket she had been wearing. It was distinctive, fringed, unusual enough that investigators hoped somebody would recognize it. Maybe a friend had seen her wearing it. Maybe a family member had bought it for her. Maybe a store employee remembered selling it. Maybe another traveler had noticed her wearing it on the road. But the jacket produced no answer. The woman remained anonymous, and as days became weeks, the investigation changed. The immediate urgency of identifying her began to collide with the reality of a case that was becoming colder. There was no obvious missing person match. There was no fingerprint identification. There was no name attached to the body. Investigators had a murder victim without a history. That is one of the most difficult situations law enforcement can face because the identity of a victim often becomes the key to understanding the crime. Where did she live? Who knew her? Who was she traveling with? Who might have wanted her dead? Where had she been in the days before her death? Without those answers, investigators were forced to work outward from almost nothing. Yet the woman herself contained clues. Her clothing could reveal where she had traveled. Her body could reveal her approximate age and physical characteristic. The environment could reveal whether she had been transported. Even pollen trapped on her clothing would eventually become part of the investigation decades later. At the time, however, investigators had no idea that some of the answers would require technology that did not yet exist. They were working in 1981. DNA profiling had not yet become a practical forensic tool. Genetic genealogy was decades away. There were no public genealogy databases capable of connecting an unknown person to distant relatives. There was no digital network where investigators could upload a genetic profile and search an enormous family tree. The tools that would eventually change the case had not been invented, so investigators relied on the evidence they had. And the evidence was frustratingly silent. The woman became known as Buckskin Girl because of the jacket. The nickname spread. It appeared in discussions of the case. It became attached to the photographs, the composite images, and the investigation itself. But behind that nickname was a person. She was not born Buckskin Girl. She had not lived her life as Jane Doe. Somewhere there had been a birth certificate with her real name. Somewhere photographs existed showing her before her death. Somewhere someone had heard her laugh. Someone had known what she wanted for dinner. Someone had argued with her, loved her, worried about her, or waited for her to come home. The tragedy was that investigators could not find those people. For years, the woman remained suspended between existence and anonymity. She was buried without the identity her family had given her. Her case became a cold case, but the search did not completely disappear. Investigators continued working to identify her, and the physical evidence was retained. That decision would prove critical because among the evidence preserved from the original investigation was something almost invisible to the world: a vial of her blood. It had been collected after her death and remained in storage for decades. Nobody in 1981 could have known how important that vial would eventually become. At the time, it was simply evidence, a biological sample connected to an unidentified murder victim. But decades later, when forensic science had advanced dramatically, that old blood sample would become something else. It would become a genetic blueprint, a way to search not only for Marcia King herself, but for people related to her. And that would change everything. Before that breakthrough, investigators tried other approaches. In 2016, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released updated forensic facial reconstructions of the woman, presenting her appearance in an attempt to generate new leads. The images circulated widely. Again, the question went out to the public. Do you recognize her? Again, there was no definitive answer. The case seemed trapped in the past, but forensic science was changing rapidly. Genetic genealogy was beginning to demonstrate that unidentified people could sometimes be connected to living relatives through DNA. The method was revolutionary because it did not require the missing person to already exist in a law enforcement database. Instead, distant relatives could provide the path. A genetic match could reveal a family branch. That branch could lead to another branch. Historical records could reconstruct generations. Eventually, an unidentified person could acquire a name. In 2017, forensic anthropologist Elizabeth Murray connected with the founders of the DNA.do project, Colleen Fitzpatrick and Margaret Press. Murray had cases. The DNA.do project had a new approach, and among those cases was the woman who had spent decades without a name, Buckskin Girl. The team began working with the preserved blood sample. The problem was formidable. The blood had been stored since 1981 and had not been refrigerated, meaning the DNA was significantly degraded. Yet researchers were able to recover enough genetic information to create a usable profile. That profile was then uploaded to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database used for genetic comparisons. And then something happened that investigators had waited 37 years to see. The genetic data began pointing toward relative. A woman who had been anonymous for nearly 4 decades suddenly had a biological family tree. She had relatives living in the modern world. She had ancestors. She had descendants of those ancestors. And somewhere within that expanding network was the answer. Her name was not Buckskin Girl. Her name was Marcia Lenore Sossaman King. She was 21 years old. She was from Arkansas. She had disappeared from the known life of her family after leaving home in 1980. Investigators had finally found her identity, but the revelation created a new question, one far more painful than the first. If this was Marcia King, then why had she been in Ohio? Where had she been during the months before her death? Who had she traveled with? And most importantly, who had taken her life? The genetic genealogy breakthrough had solved the mystery of the victim. It had not solved the murder. In fact, it had reopened it. For the first time in 37 years, investigators could stop asking who the dead woman was and begin asking who had killed Marcia King. And somewhere beyond the road where her body was found, somewhere in the memories of people who had known her, somewhere in the places she had traveled before that terrible April night, there might still be an answer waiting, because Marcia King had finally been given back her name. But the man who killed her had not been given one, and that meant the case was not over. It had only entered its next, darker chapter. The discovery of Marcia King's identity changed the case in a way investigators had not experienced for nearly 4 decades, because for 37 years, every question had started with the same uncertainty. Who was the woman found beside that Ohio road? But now that uncertainty was gone, and with a name came a history, a family, a birthplace, and a life that could finally be reconstructed piece by piece from records and memories that had existed all along. Marcia Lenore Sossaman King had been 21 years old when she was killed, and she was from Arkansas. Thousands of details about her life had been waiting in documents, photographs, and the memories of relatives who had never known what had happened to her. Her family had known she was missing, but they had not known where she had gone. And for decades they had lived without the certainty that she was dead, while investigators in Ohio had lived with an unidentified murder victim whose identity seemed almost impossible to recover. The two sides of that tragedy had existed separately until genetic genealogy finally connected them. And when the DNA Do Project announced the identification in 2018, the Buckskin Girl finally became Marcia King. But the relief of identification came with another devastating reality. Marcia had not simply disappeared. She had been murdered, and the discovery of her remains in Ohio meant that whatever journey had taken her away from Arkansas had ended in violence, leaving investigators with a new map to follow. One that stretched from the life she had lived. Before disappearing to the rural roadside where her body had been discovered, the distance between those places became one of the central mysteries, because Marcia had not been a local woman, and nothing about the scene immediately explained why she was there. Investigators now knew her identity, but they still did not know the complete story of her final months, her final days, or her final hours, and that gap became the next target of the investigation. Detectives began looking backward through Marcia's life, examining where she had lived, whom she had known, and where she may have traveled. They sought people who might remember seeing her after she left Arkansas, because every witness who had once seemed irrelevant to an unidentified Jane Doe could now become potentially important. Someone might remember Marcia's clothing, her voice, her companions, her destination, or a conversation that seemed ordinary at the time but could become crucial decades later. The buckskin jacket itself took on a new meaning, because what had once been the only recognizable symbol attached to an unidentified woman was now clothing belonging to a specific person with a real identity, and investigators could ask a much more precise question. Who had seen Marcia wearing that jacket before she disappeared? The jacket had become famous because of the case, but the woman inside it had finally been restored to the historical record, And that distinction mattered because Marcia had spent decades being remembered primarily through an object. While her real identity remained hidden, now the object could potentially help investigators reconstruct her movements. But even with the identification, the physical evidence from the original crime remained central. Investigators had determined that Marcia had suffered blunt force trauma and strangulation, and the circumstances of her discovery suggested that she had not simply wandered into the location where she was found. Her bare feet were clean, and investigators believed she was likely transported there after being killed elsewhere. That possibility created another layer of uncertainty because if Marcia had been killed somewhere else, the road where her body was discovered might not contain the most important evidence of what happened to her. The actual crime scene could have been somewhere miles away, perhaps inside a vehicle, a residence, or another location that investigators had never identified, and the person responsible might have known that leaving her beside a rural road would make the investigation more difficult, yet the offender had made a mistake that would prove impossible to erase completely. He had left Marcia's body behind, and with it came evidence, even if that evidence did not immediately reveal his identity. As years passed, the investigation periodically returned to the public eye, but the case remained stubbornly unresolved. The identity of the victim was still unknown, and without that identity, the investigation lacked one of its most important foundations. Then genetic genealogy changed the equation. The DNA-DO Projectus work on the case demonstrated that even severely degraded biological evidence could sometimes yield enough information to identify an unknown person. The preserved blood sample from Marcia became the key, and the genealogical process transformed fragments of genetic information into relationships. Those relationships became family trees, and the family trees eventually converged on the name Marcia King. It was a remarkable scientific achievement, but it also created a deeply emotional moment for Marcia's family because after 37 years, they could finally know what had happened to her. Yet knowing she had been murdered was a terrible truth to receive. The uncertainty had ended, but it had been replaced by grief, and the investigation immediately became a homicide case with a named victim rather than an unidentified body. That difference may sound technical, but it is enormous because a victim's identity opens doors that anonymity keeps closed. Investigators can search family connections, employment records, friendships, travel histories, and personal relationships. They can ask people who knew the victim to reconstruct her movements, and they can investigate her disappearance as a specific event rather than as an isolated body found beside a road. Marcia's identification, therefore, gave detectives an entirely new starting point. But it also revealed how little was still known about her final journey. She had disappeared from Arkansas, somehow ended up in Ohio, and was found dead near Troy, and investigators needed to understand the path between those points. One of the most important questions became whether Marcia had been traveling alone, because if she was accompanied by someone, that person could potentially have been the last person to see her alive, and perhaps the person responsible for her death. Investigators also needed to know whether Marcia had been hitchhiking, traveling with acquaintances, working temporarily, visiting someone, or moving through the country for reasons that her family did not know. Every possibility mattered because a cold case can turn on a single forgotten encounter. A person who remembers meeting someone decades earlier, a receipt, a photograph, a motel record, a vehicle description, or a conversation that seemed meaningless until the victim's identity became known. But time creates an enormous obstacle because witnesses age, memories fade, records disappear, and people who might once have known the answer may no longer be alive, and that is one of the cruelest aspects of a decades-old homicide. Investigators are often forced to reconstruct a world that no longer exists. Roads have changed, buildings have disappeared, businesses have closed, and communities have transformed. Yet the murder remains fixed in the past, waiting for investigators to recover enough of that lost world to understand what happened in Marcia's case. The investigation had already demonstrated that patience could produce extraordinary results. 37 years after her death, science had given her back her name, and that raised the possibility that other evidence might still be capable of producing the next breakthrough. Authorities continued to seek information from the public, particularly anyone who may have known Marcia during the period before her death or who may have encountered her in Ohio, because there was one. Question that genetic genealogy could not answer, the identity of the killer. DNA had identified the victim because her relatives provided a genetic pathway. But the killeress identity required a different pathway. Investigators needed either a direct forensic connection, a witness, a confession, a reliable investigative letter, or some other evidence capable of establishing who was responsible, and that evidence had not yet emerged publicly, meaning that despite the spectacular identification of Marcia, her murder remained a cold case. This distinction became essential because the headline could easily become misleading. Marcia King had been identified, but her killer had not, and those were two very different victories. One solved the mystery surrounding the victim. The other remained the unanswered question at the center of the homicide. For Marcia's family, that distinction must have been especially painful because the identification answered the question they had been asking for decades, but it immediately created another, perhaps even harder one. Who did this to her? The name Marcia King had finally returned to the case, but the name of her murderer was still missing, and that absence became the new focus. The investigation had traveled from anonymity to identity, from Jane Doe to Marcia, but now it had to travel from victim to offender. And there was no guarantee that the journey would be short. Genetic genealogy had demonstrated that the past could still reveal secrets, but it could not guarantee that every secret would yield. Investigators had to search through old records, reconsider old assumptions, and identify people who might have crossed paths with Marcia during her final months. And every possibility carried the same haunting thought: someone knew more than they had ever said. Perhaps someone remembered seeing Marcia in 1980. Perhaps someone remembered the buckskin jacket. Perhaps someone remembered a young woman traveling through the region. Perhaps someone remembered a man who suddenly disappeared from their lives after that sprint. And perhaps someone had been carrying a secret for decades. The challenge was finding that person before time erased the memory completely, and so the case entered another long period of uncertainty. But this time it was different, because investigators were no longer searching for an unknown woman. They were searching for the killer of Marcia King, a 21-year-old woman whose identity had finally been restored, whose family finally knew where she had ended up, and whose story had finally escaped the anonymity that had defined it for almost 4 decades. The buckskin jacket remained an unforgettable symbol, but now it was attached to a real person, a real family, and a real life. And that made the unanswered question even more painful, because once you know the victim's name, the silence surrounding the killer becomes impossible to ignore. Marcia King was no longer a Jane Doe, but somewhere beyond the evidence, beyond the records, beyond the memories that had survived the years, the person responsible for her death still remained unidentified, and the road that had once concealed Marcia's identity now seemed to point toward a different mystery. Not who was the woman in the buckskin jacket, but who had left her there, and why. By the time Marcia King had been identified, the case had crossed an invisible line that few cold cases ever reach, because the victim was no longer a mystery. Yet the murder itself remained almost completely unexplained, and for investigators that created a strange new landscape. They finally knew who they were looking for justice for, but they still did not know exactly who had taken her life, where the killing had occurred, or what had happened during the final journey that carried a young woman from Arkansas to a lonely road in Ohio. The name Marcia Lenore Sossaman King transformed the case from an unidentified person investigation into a homicide investigation with a history, and that history offered investigators something they had never possessed before: a place to begin. Marcia was 21 years old when she died, and the information recovered about her life gave investigators a clearer picture of the woman behind the famous nickname. She had been a real person with a family, relationships, plans, and a past that existed long before the buckskin jacket became associated with her, but there was still a large gap between the last confirmed pieces of her life and the discovery of her body. And that gap became the central territory of the renewed investigation. Investigators needed to reconstruct Marcia's movements as carefully as possible, because every place she had visited and every person she had encountered could potentially contain a clue, and the task was extraordinarily difficult because the murder had occurred decades earlier. Memories that might have been fresh in 1981 were now 40 years old. People who had been young adults at the time were now elderly. Businesses had closed. Records had disappeared, and some witnesses might have died without ever realizing that a woman they encountered had later become one of Ohio's most enduring homicide mysteries. But the investigation could now ask specific questions, and specificity is powerful, especially in a cold case. Instead of asking the public to identify an unknown woman from a forensic sketch, investigators could ask whether anyone remembered Marcia King, whether anyone had traveled with her, whether anyone had seen her in Ohio, whether anyone remembered her distinctive buckskin jacket, or whether anyone had information about the circumstances that brought her to Miami County. Every new detail could become a thread, and investigators knew that somewhere those threads might intersect with the person responsible for her death. The original discovery scene remained crucial because the location where Marcia's body was found appeared to be more consistent with a disposal site than the place where the murder itself occurred. Her bare feet were clean, a detail that suggested she had not walked through the surrounding environment before she died, and investigators believed she may have been transported to the location after being killed, if that interpretation was correct. Then the most important crime scene might never have been discovered, and that meant the person responsible had potentially chosen the roadside deliberately, selecting a place where the body could be abandoned without immediately revealing where the killing happened. That possibility created an enormous investigative challenge because investigators were now searching for two locations, the place where Marcia had been killed and the place where her body had been left, and the two locations could have been separated by miles, perhaps even by a route known only to the offender. The surrounding geography offered one clue. The body was discovered near Troy, not far from Interstate 75, a major north-south highway connecting communities across the region, and that proximity raised obvious questions about travel, transportation, and access. Someone driving through the area could have reached the rural location relatively easily and then returned to the highway, meaning the offender might not have been from Miami County at all. He could have been passing through, living somewhere nearby, working in the region, or traveling with Marcia from another state. The highway connection, therefore, became part of the mystery. But it could not identify the killer by itself. Investigators also had to examine Marcia's clothing and personal belongings because objects can survive where memories do not. The buckskin jacket was particularly distinctive, and its presence suggested that someone might have recognized her from the clothing alone. Yet despite the jacket becoming one of the most recognizable symbols in the case, no one came forward with a definitive identification during those early decades. After Marcia was identified, investigators could finally place that jacket into context. It was no longer simply something worn by an unknown woman. It had been worn by Marcia King, and that meant anyone who remembered seeing the jacket could potentially have remembered Marcia herself, perhaps without realizing her significance at the time. That distinction became important in public appeal because witnesses sometimes remember objects more clearly than faces, especially after decades, and the unusual appearance of the jacket might trigger a memory that a generic description of a young woman could not. Yet the investigation faced another obstacle. There was no single dramatic piece of evidence publicly known to connect a specific person to the crime. No publicly announced suspect had emerged, and no confirmed motive had been established. The case therefore remained open, but deeply uncertain, and that uncertainty was amplified by the fact that Marcia's identity had been solved through genetic genealogy rather than through conventional detective work. The breakthrough had demonstrated that science could recover a name from decades-old evidence, but identifying a victim and identifying a murderer are fundamentally different problems. Marcia's genetic relatives provided the pathway to her identity because the DNA-DO project could search for family relationships, but the killer might have left no comparable genealogical trail that investigators could publicly follow. And even if biological evidence from the killer existed, investigators would still need a usable profile and a pathway to connect it to a specific individual. This was the frustrating reality facing the case after 2018. Mystery had been solved, but the most important criminal question remained: who killed Marcia King? The answer could be hidden in a memory, an old record, an overlooked witness statement, or biological evidence that had never been fully interpreted, and investigators had to consider all of those possibilities without knowing which one would matter most. Cold cases often become difficult not because there are no clues, but because there are too many incomplete clues, each one pointing toward a possibility without providing enough information to establish certainty. And Marchia's case was filled with those fragments: a young woman from Arkansas, a journey that brought her to Ohio, a distinctive jacket, a remote roadside, evidence suggesting transportation, and a murder that left investigators without a name for decades. Each fragment told part of the story, but none told the whole story, and the person who could connect those fragments remained silent, perhaps because the offender was dead, perhaps because the offender was still alive, perhaps because someone else knew what happened and had never spoken. Investigators could not assume which possibility was true, and that uncertainty made every lead important. The passage of time also changed the potential suspect pool, because anyone who had been an adult in 1981 would now be much older, while anyone who had been a child would have memories that might be incomplete or secondhand. Witnesses who had once been available might no longer be reachable, and people who had information might not even realize that what they remembered could matter. This is why public appeals remain important in old cases, because investigators are sometimes not looking for someone who knows the entire story. They are looking for someone who remembers one small moment, one meeting, one vehicle, one conversation, one unusual event, something that seemed insignificant at the time but becomes meaningful when placed beside the known fact. And Marchia's case is particularly suited to that kind of memory search because her life appears to have involved movement across state lines, meaning there may have been many people who encountered her briefly without knowing who she was: the person who gave her a ride, the person who saw her at a business, the person who spoke with her at a roadside stop, the person who noticed the buckskin jacket, the person who may have seen her with another individual. Any of those encounters could potentially help reconstruct her final journey, but the most haunting possibility is that someone already knows the answer. Someone may have carried knowledge of Marchia's death for decades. Watching the case appear in newspapers and later watching the remarkable announcement that the buckskin girl had finally been identified, and if that person recognized something they knew, they would have faced a choice: remain silent or come forward. Cold cases often depend on that choice, because science can reveal identities, but witnesses can reveal circumstances, and sometimes the smallest human memory becomes the final piece that a laboratory cannot provide. The identification of Marcia King, therefore, did not bring the kind of ending people might expect from a headline about a 37-year-old mystery. Instead, it created a new beginning. Her family finally had a name to grieve. Investigators finally had a victim whose life could be reconstructed, and the public finally knew that the woman remembered as the buckskin girl had once been Marcia. But the killer remained outside that circle of certainty, and the absence of his name became more conspicuous with every passing year, because once the victim has a name, the question of who killed her becomes sharper, more personal, more urgent, and more difficult to ignore. The case was no longer about an unknown woman abandoned beside a road. It was about Marcia King, a 21-year-old woman whose life ended violently in Ohio, and the person who left her there had managed to remain hidden for decades, perhaps believing that time would erase the evidence, perhaps believing that the world would eventually forget the young woman in the buckskin jacket. But time had not erased her. Science had given her name back. Investigators had reopened the search, and her story had returned to public attention, which meant the past was once again knocking on the door, asking anyone who knew something to speak. And somewhere within that unanswered history was the possibility of the final clue, the one piece of information that could transform Marcia King's case from an identified victim into a solved murder. Until then, the mystery remained, and the road where she was found continued to carry the weight of a question that had survived for more than 4 decades, a question that could be reduced to only 5 words: who killed Marcia King? The question of who killed Marcia King became even more haunting once investigators knew exactly who she was, because anonymity had once been the central obstacle, and now anonymity belonged to the killer instead. Marcia was no longer a nameless young woman remembered only by the buckskin jacket she wore when her body was discovered. She had a family name, a hometown, a history, and people who could finally speak about her as the person she had been. But the circumstances surrounding her final journey remained painfully incomplete, and the further investigators looked into those missing years, the more the case began to resemble a puzzle with several pieces permanently separated from the picture. Marcia had disappeared from Arkansas, and sometime afterward she arrived in Ohio, but the exact route she took and the people she encountered along the way remained uncertain. The distance between her known life and the place where her body was found was not merely geographical, it represented an enormous investigative gap, a period during which someone must have seen her, spoken with her, traveled with her, or crossed paths with her. And among those people could have been the person responsible for her death. The challenge was that nobody had been able to connect those encounters to a homicide at the time, because when Marcia was found, investigators did not know who she was, and that meant every witness was effectively being asked to remember a stranger, a young woman whose name could not be attached to the description. That limitation shaped the investigation in ways that would remain significant decades later. Detectives could describe her physical characteristics and clothing, but they could not say, "This is Marcia King. She is from Arkansas. She was last known to be traveling, and she may have been looking for someone or somewhere without a name." The investigation was forced to rely heavily on the circumstances of the body itself, and those circumstances suggested that Marcia had probably not died exactly where she was found. The cleanliness of her bare feet was particularly striking because it suggested she had not walked through the area before being discovered, strengthening the possibility that her body had been transported. If so, the roadside was not the primary crime scene. It was a place chosen afterward, and that distinction could explain why investigators struggled to uncover the full story. The person responsible may have killed Marcia somewhere else and then driven to the location where she was abandoned, using the road and surrounding landscape as a place to conceal her. The proximity to Interstate 75 made the location particularly significant because major highways offer rapid access across large distances, and someone could enter the area, leave a body, and continue traveling without immediately attracting attention. But this was only one possibility, and investigators could not know whether the killer was local or passing through, whether Marcia knew the person responsible or encountered him by chance, whether the murder was the result of an existing relationship or a brief meeting that turned violent. Those questions remained open, and without answers, the investigation had to resist the temptation to construct a story simply because one seemed plausible. Cold cases are dangerous territory for assumption because when evidence is incomplete, theories can become stronger than fact, and investigators returning to an old case must separate what is known from what is merely possible, what was documented from what has been inferred, and what can be proven from what simply seems likely. Marcia's case demanded exactly that discipline, especially after her identity was established through genetic genealogy, because the breakthrough was so extraordinary that it could create the illusion that the entire mystery had been solved. But the genetic identification answered only one question. It did not reveal the person responsible for her death, and investigators still needed evidence that could establish the circumstances of the homicide and identify the offender. The search therefore returned to the evidence preserved from 1981, examining what might still be useful after decades, and this is where the story of Marcia King becomes a powerful example of why old evidence should not automatically be considered obsolete. Scientific techniques continue to evolve, and evidence that once seemed incapable of answering a question can sometimes become valuable when technology changes. The preserved blood sample had already demonstrated that principle because the same material collected during the original investigation ultimately provided the genetic information needed to identify Marcia, and that raised an obvious possibility other evidence connected to the case might still contain information that had not yet been fully understood. The challenge was determining what could be tested, what could still yield reliable information, and whether any resulting profile could be connected to a known individual. Investigators could not assume that modern technology would automatically solve every problem, but they also could not afford to assume that old evidence had nothing left to say. That tension is at the heart of many cold cases. The evidence is old, but the science is new, and investigators have to find the point where those two worlds meet. In Marcia's case, genetic genealogy had already accomplished something extraordinary. It had reached backward through time and recovered a name that had been lost for 37 years, and the same basic philosophy could be applied to the murder itself. Look again, test again, compare again, and ask questions that investigators in 1981 could not have asked yet. The killer remained unidentified, which meant that the case still depended heavily on information from the public. Someone might remember Marcia from the period before her death. Someone might remember seeing her in Ohio. Someone might remember traveling with her. Someone might know why she came to the region. And someone might recognize a detail about the case that had seemed insignificant decades earlier. Public appeals in cold cases can feel almost impossible because investigators are asking people to search memories that may be more than 40 years old, but human memory is unpredictable, and sometimes one unusual detail survives for reasons nobody can explain. A face may fade while a jacket remains vivid. A name may disappear while a vehicle remains unforgettable. A conversation may become blurry while the location remains clear. Investigators, therefore, need witnesses to examine their own memories without assuming that they know what matters, because the detail that appears insignificant to one person may be exactly what detectives need, and the Marcia King case contains many such possibilities. Her distinctive clothing, her movement across state lines, the unusual circumstances of her discovery, and the possibility that she was transported after her death all create avenues through which a forgotten memory might become meaningful. Yet there is another reason this case continues to haunt investigators. The identity of the victim had once been considered almost impossible to recover, and then science proved otherwise. That means the case has already demonstrated that seemingly impossible questions can eventually be answered, and once one impossible barrier falls, investigators naturally begin asking whether another can fall as well. If genetic genealogy could tell them who the buckskin girl was, could modern forensic techniques eventually tell them who killed her? If the past could give up Marcia's name after 37 years, could it also give up the name of the person responsible? There is no guarantee, but the possibility remains. And that possibility is what keeps a cold case alive. The investigation does not need certainty that the next clue exists. It only needs reason to keep looking. And Marcia's case provides that reason, because the greatest breakthrough in the investigation happened after decades of apparent failure, proving that time had not destroyed everything. The blood sample survived, the genetic information survived, the family connections survived, and Marcia's identity survived somewhere inside all of it, waiting for investigators to find the correct path. But the same passage of time that preserved evidence also destroyed opportunities. Witnesses moved away, memories faded, and people who might have known Marcia during her final months may no longer be available to answer questions. The investigation, therefore, exists in a race against history, trying to recover information before it disappears completely, and every year, because there may still be someone alive who remembers something about Marcia in 1980. But that person may not realize that their memory could help solve a murder. That is why the story cannot simply be left in the past, because the past may still contain information capable of changing the present. Marcia's family waited decades just to learn her name, and when that name finally emerged, the emotional impact was enormous. But identification was never supposed to be the final destination. It was supposed to be the beginning of a more focused search. Now investigators knew who the victim was, which meant they could ask better questions, follow more specific leads, and reconstruct a life rather than a mystery. They could search for people who had known Marcia, examine her movements, and attempt to understand why she ended up in Ohio. Every answer could potentially narrow the field surrounding her kill, and every unanswered question could reveal another direction for investigators to explore. But until that final connection is made, the case remains suspended between two truths. Marcia King has been identified, and the person who killed her has not. One mystery has been solved, while the other remains painfully alive, and that is why the image of the young woman beside the Ohio road continues to carry such weight, because for decades the world could not even say her name. Now it can, and that name has become a demand for something more. Not revenge, not speculation, but truth. The truth of where Marcia went, the truth of what happened to her, and the truth of who was responsible. Somewhere in the years between her disappearance and the discovery of her body, there is a missing chapter, and until someone finds that chapter, the case remains open. The road remains part of the story. The buckskin jacket remains an unforgettable symbol, and Marcia King remains at the center of a mystery that has already survived more than 4 decades, waiting for the one piece of evidence, the one witness, or the one breakthrough that can finally give investigators the answer they have been seeking since 1981. The investigation into Marcia King had now entered its most difficult phase because the mystery was no longer hidden behind an unknown identity, but behind an unknown journey, and reconstructing that journey required investigators to travel backward through a world that had almost completely disappeared, a world of handwritten records, paper photographs, roadside businesses, old telephone numbers, forgotten acquaintances, and memories that had been aging for more than 4 decades. Marcia had a name now, but a name alone could not explain how she ended up dead in Ohio, and every attempt to reconstruct her final movements raised another question. Where had she been? Who had she been with? And why did nobody come forward with the information that could explain those missing days? The most important period was the time between Marcia leaving Arkansas and the moment her body was discovered near Troy, because somewhere inside that span was the answer to the murder. Investigators knew she had not simply appeared beside Greenlee Road, and the condition of her body suggested that the location where she was found may have been a disposal site rather than the original place of the killing, which meant that the person responsible had potentially driven her there after she was already dead. And if that was true, the offender had made a journey of his own, carrying a secret that would eventually become one of the longest-running homicide mysteries in Ohio. The possibility of transportation also meant that investigators could not limit their thinking to the immediate area. The killer might have lived nearby, or might have traveled through the region, or might have known the roads well enough to select a secluded location while remaining close to a major interstate. And without a witness to the disposal, detectives were left with geography as one of the few clues capable of describing the offender's actions, but geography could only narrow possibilities. It could not produce a name, and that was the fundamental problem. Investigators had a victim, a location, evidence of violence, and a timeline, but no confirmed offender, no publicly established motive, and no definitive explanation for why Marcia was in Ohio. The case therefore remained suspended in a state of uncertainty, and uncertainty becomes more difficult with every passing year because the people who might have solved the mystery gradually disappear. Some witnesses die. Others move, memories become less reliable, and documents that once seemed permanent can be lost or destroyed. Investigators working a 40-year-old homicide are often trying to reconstruct an entire social world from fragments, and Marcia's case was no different. Yet the identification created one enormous advantage. People could finally search their memories for a specific person rather than an unidentified face. Relatives could provide photographs, investigators could examine her background, and public appeals could use her name, all of which increased the possibility that someone who had crossed paths with her would recognize the connection. The challenge was getting that person to realize that their memory mattered, because many witnesses in cold cases do not remember a dramatic event. They remember something ordinary: a young woman standing at a bus stop, a stranger asking for directions, someone hitchhiking, a person entering a vehicle, a brief conversation at a store, a jacket seen from across a parking lot, an encounter lasting only minutes, and when nothing appeared unusual at the time, the memory could have been filed away and forgotten. Only decades later, after learning about Marcia's identity, might someone suddenly realize that the young woman they remembered could have been her. That possibility makes public appeals so important because detectives are not necessarily searching for someone who witnessed the murder. They may simply need someone who can place Marcia somewhere during the period before her death. A single confirmed location could create a new timeline, and a new timeline could reveal another person, another vehicle, another destination, another connection. Cold case investigations often move through these chains of small discoveries, rarely through one dramatic revelation. And the Marcia King case is particularly suited to that approach because so much of her final journey remains unclear. Investigators have publicly sought information about her and her movements, asking anyone who may have known her or encountered her to come forward, and those appeals carry a unique emotional weight because Marcia's family waited decades just to learn that she had not simply vanished without explanation. She had been killed, and the people who loved her deserved more than a name on a grave. They deserved to know what happened. But the investigation also had to confront an uncomfortable possibility. The person responsible may have been someone Marcia knew, because the available facts do not allow investigators or responsible storytellers to simply assume that the offender was a stranger. The same uncertainty applies in the opposite direction. There is no basis to claim that the killer was known to her. And that restraint is essential because cold cases can easily become contaminated by speculation when investigators lack enough evidence to establish relationships, motives, or circumstances. The truth may eventually emerge from evidence, but until then, every theory remains only a theory. And Marcia's story deserves to be told through what can actually be supported. The confirmed facts are already extraordinary enough. She was 21. She was from Arkansas. She was found murdered in Ohio. She was unidentified for 37 years, and genetic genealogy finally restored her identity. Those facts alone demonstrate how dramatically a case can change when science advances, and the same scientific progress offers hope that other evidence might eventually become more useful. DNA technology has continued to evolve, databases have expanded, and forensic genealogical methods have become increasingly capable of helping investigators work with unidentified remains and unidentified offenders. But the existence of advanced technology does not guarantee a solution, and investigators must still have suitable evidence, a usable profile, and a legitimate investigative pathway. If biological evidence from the offender exists and can be tested, it could potentially become important, but investigators have not publicly identified a definitive DNA-based suspect in Marcia's homicide, and that means the case remains open. The distinction between identification and resolution is crucial because Marcia's case became famous, partly because genetic genealogy succeeded where conventional methods had failed. But genetic genealogy did not identify her killer. It identified her, and that achievement should not be confused with a solved homicide. Instead, it created a foundation from which the next stage of investigation could begin, and that foundation is powerful because the victim is no longer anonymous. Her family can be contacted, her history can be researched, and people who knew her can come forward. Every photograph becomes more meaningful, every old memory can be reconsidered, and every piece of information about her life can potentially reveal something about the circumstances surrounding her death. There is also something deeply symbolic about the way Marcia's identity was recovered, because the evidence used to identify her had been collected. During the original investigation and preserved for decades, it had no voice, no context, and no obvious connection to the woman's family, but inside that biological material was a genetic record that survived long after human memory began to fade. The science did not create Marcia's identity, it uncovered it. The name had always existed, the family had always existed, the life had always existed, but the connection between them had been lost, and genetic genealogy restored it. That same principle offers a faint but important hope for the homicide itself, because evidence can survive longer than expectation. A clue that seemed useless in 1981 may become meaningful decades later, and a person who seemed unrelated may become relevant when a new investigative theory changes the way the evidence is interpreted. This is why cold cases are rarely as dead as they appear. They are often dormant, waiting for technology, information, or memory to change the circumstances. But there is another side to that hope, and it is the passage of time, because every year makes the search harder, not easier. If someone knows what happened to Marcia, that person is now older than they were in 1981, and if they have carried the information silently, the opportunity to speak may eventually disappear. That reality creates urgency around every unsolved case, not because investigators are chasing headlines, but because human witnesses are temporary, evidence can degrade, and opportunities can close forever. Marcia's family has already experienced the unimaginable passage of time, waiting decades before learning the fate of someone they loved, and the possibility that the person responsible could remain unidentified indefinitely is another painful burden. The difference now is that the case has a name the world can remember, and names matter because anonymity can make a victim disappear twice. First from life and then from history, Marcia was denied her identity in the public record for 37 years, but she was eventually restored to it, and that restoration means the case can no longer be reduced to a faceless Jane Doe beside a road. She was Marcia King, and she had a family, a life, and a story that existed before the murder. The unanswered question is now attached to that story, and the person responsible remains the missing piece. Somewhere in the chain of events that brought Marcia to Ohio, someone may have information that investigators have never received. Someone may remember a conversation, a ride, a meeting, or a vehicle. Someone may have seen her during the final days of her life, and someone may know why the woman in the buckskin jacket never made it home. The case has already proven that the impossible can become possible after decades, because for 37 years, investigators could not even name the victim, and then a degraded blood sample and a revolutionary genealogical technique changed that. So the question now becomes whether the same persistence can produce the second breakthrough, whether another forgotten clue is waiting somewhere, whether another witness will finally recognize the importance of what they remember, whether another forensic development will reveal information hidden inside the surviving evidence, and whether the name of Marcia King's killer is already somewhere inside the investigative record, waiting to be connected to the crime. Until that happens, the road near Troy remains part of a mystery that refuses to disappear. The buckskin jacket remains an enduring symbol, and Marcia's name remains a reminder that identifying a victim is only one step toward justice, because after 37 years of being unknown, Marcia King finally received back name she had always owned, but the person who took her life remains unidentified, and the silence surrounding that name is now the final barrier standing between an extraordinary forensic breakthrough and a completely solved case. The silence surrounding Marcia King was not the silence of an empty case file, because behind the unanswered questions were years of investigation, preserved evidence, public appeal, and the stubborn refusal of investigators to allow a young woman's murder to disappear completely into history. But the silence was still there, and it belonged to the person who knew what happened to her, if that person was still alive, because Marcia's death had occurred in a world that no longer existed, a world before smartphones, before social media, before modern forensic databases, before genetic genealogy could transform a fragment of blood into a family tree. And every year that passed made the distance between the investigators and the original crime wider, yet the evidence continued to point backward toward a spring morning in 1981 when 3 people discovered a young woman beside Greenlee Road in Miami County, Ohio, and toward the unanswered events that had placed her there. Investigators had already established that Marcia had suffered a violent death, and the condition of her body suggested that she had been transported, meaning the location where she was found may never have been the place where the fatal attack occurred. That single possibility changed the geography of the entire investigation, because the roadside could explain where Marcia's story ended, but it could not necessarily explain where it began. And if the killer had driven her there after the murder, then another location existed somewhere beyond the scene, another place where evidence might once have existed, another place where someone might have heard or seen something, and another place that might have connected Marcia to the person responsible. The problem was that nobody knew where that location was, and decades later it could be almost impossible to identify. Buildings could have changed, properties could have been demolished, roads altered, businesses closed, and landscapes transformed, but perhaps the most important change was invisible. The people themselves had aged, and memories that might have been crystal clear in 1981 had been filtered through 40 years of life, yet investigators continued to ask questions because one forgotten memory can sometimes survive longer than an entire paper trail, especially when the memory involves something unusual. And Marcia's appearance had certainly been unusual enough to stand out. Her buckskin jacket with fringe was distinctive, and investigators had used it as one of the defining details in the effort to identify her. But the jacket also represented the strange way the case had existed for so long. The public knew the victim through an object before it knew her. through her name. The buckskin girl became a case identity because her real identity was inaccessible, and that nickname carried the story through newspapers, television reports, forensic databases, and public discussions for decades. But behind the nickname was a 21-year-old woman whose life had been interrupted, and when genetic genealogy finally revealed her identity in 2018, the transformation was profound. The buckskin girl became Marcia King, and suddenly the case had a family attached to it, a history attached to it, and a human identity that could no longer be reduced to a forensic description. Investigators could now look for people who had known Marcia rather than people who merely recognized a photograph, and that opened an entirely different avenue of investigation. Relatives could describe her personality, her habits, her relationships, and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance, while investigators could examine the timeline of her life and compare it with the physical evidence recovered in Ohio. The process was painstaking because the goal was not to create a dramatic story but to determine what could actually be proven, and in a cold case, that distinction is everything. Every theory has to be tested. Every lead has to be evaluated, and every assumption has to be treated as uncertain until evidence supports it. That discipline matters particularly in a case that had attracted public attention for decades, because the longer a mystery remains unsolved, the more theories accumulate around it, and some theories can become accepted simply because they are repeated often enough. But repetition does not turn speculation into fact, and Marcia's case still has important unanswered questions, including exactly where she had been before arriving in Ohio, how she traveled, who she was with, and what happened immediately before her death. The answers could be connected, or they could lead in completely different directions. Investigators cannot know until evidence establishes the connection. And this is where the passage of time becomes both the greatest enemy and one of the strangest allies of a cold case. Time destroys some things, but it can also change the value of others. Technology improves. Databases grow. Old evidence can be re-examined, and information that once seemed unrelated can suddenly become relevant. The identification of Marcia itself proved this, because the preserved blood sample had remained for decades while the technology required to interpret its genetic information continued to develop. In 1981, nobody could use genetic genealogy to identify an unknown homicide victim. But decades later, investigators could use genetic information to locate distant relatives and construct a family tree. The science had changed, but the evidence had remained, and that combination created the breakthrough. The same principle offers a reason to continue examining old evidence in the homicide itself, because forensic science is not static, and techniques that investigators could not use in 1981 may be different from the techniques available today. But there is also a danger in assuming that technology will automatically solve everything. Forensic science requires suitable evidence, and not every case contains biological material capable of producing a usable profile. Even when DNA exists, investigators may still face contamination, degradation, incomplete profiles, or the simple absence of a database connection, so the case cannot depend entirely on a future laboratory miracle. Human investigation remains essential, and that means identifying witnesses, reconstructing movements, reviewing records, and asking the public for information. Sometimes the most valuable clue is not hidden inside a laboratory sample at all. It is hidden inside somebody else's memory, and investigators know that there may be people who encountered Marcia without understanding the significance of the encounter. Perhaps someone gave her transportation. Perhaps someone saw her at a roadside location. Perhaps someone remembers her traveling through the area. Perhaps someone knew the person she was traveling with. Or perhaps someone witnessed something unusual around the time of her disappearance. These possibilities cannot be confirmed without information. And that is why the case remains dependent on the public. The person who eventually provides the breakthrough may not even realize they possess it yet. They may have forgotten a name but remembered a face, forgotten a face but remembered a vehicle, forgotten the exact date but remembered the season, forgotten the conversation but remembered that something about the encounter felt strange. Cold case investigations often work by assembling those imperfect fragments until a pattern appears, and Marcia's case already contains one extraordinary example of fragments becoming a pattern. Genetic genealogy took scattered biological relationships and assembled them into a family connection strong enough to identify her. The same investigative philosophy can be applied to the circumstances of her death. A fragmented timeline can be assembled, witnesses can be re-examined, evidence can be retested, and old assumptions can be challenged. But until that happens, there is a painful imbalance in the case. Marcia has been found, identified, and returned to her family as history, while the person responsible for her death remains outside the narrative, and that imbalance is precisely what keeps the case alive, because a homicide investigation does not become irrelevant simply because decades have passed. The victim does not become less important with age, and the responsibility to seek answers does not expire. Marcia's family waited 37 years to know her fate, and even after the identification, the story remained unfinished, because knowing her name could not explain why she died. The identification could not restore the years she had lost, and it could not tell her loved ones who had been responsible. But it did something essential. It made the victim visible again. And once a victim is visible, the public can remember her, investigators can speak her name, and witnesses can reconsider their memory. The transformation from Jane Doe to Marcia King was therefore more than a forensic achievement. It was a restoration of identity, and identity is often the foundation upon which the rest of a homicide investigation can be built. The question now is whether the remaining evidence can support the next transformation. From an unsolved murder to an identified offender, there is no public evidence establishing that the killer has been named, and responsible reporting must not invent one, because the absence of an answer is itself part of the story. Marcia's case remains unresolved, and that unresolved status is what gives the investigation its haunting quality. A person can be identified without justice being complete. A family can learn what happened without learning who caused it. And a case can move forward while still carrying the weight of decades of uncertainty. That is where Marcia King's story stands. Not as a mystery without clues, but as a mystery with clues whose final connections have not yet been made. And somewhere between Arkansas and Ohio, between the life Marcia once knew and the road where her body was discovered, there may still be information capable of changing everything. Perhaps it exists in an old photograph, a forgotten address, a memory that has never been reported, or evidence that has not yet yielded everything it contains. Perhaps the answer is held by someone who has remained silent for decades, or perhaps the person responsible is no longer alive and the truth will have to be reconstructed entirely through physical evidence. Investigators cannot know which path will ultimately lead to the answer, but the case has already demonstrated that time does not always destroy the truth. Sometimes it merely hides it until someone develops the ability to see it, and Marcia King's name is proof of that. For 37 years, she was known only as the Buckskin Girl, a young woman whose family could not find her, whose investigators could not identify her. Then, a vial of blood, preserved since 1981, became the key to a genetic investigation that finally restored her name, and that achievement leaves the case with one final, enormous question. If science could find Marcia after all those years, what else might still be waiting to be found? Because the person who killed her may have left something behind, a trace, a witness, a connection, a memory, something that has been overlooked, not because it does not exist, but because nobody has yet recognized its meaning. And until that final clue emerges, the story of Marcia King remains unfinished, her name known, her death established, her killer unidentified, and the road near Troy still carrying the weight of a question that has refused to disappear for more than 4 decades. The name Marcia King had finally broken through decades of silence, but a name was not the same thing as an answer, and as investigators continued examining the case, the most difficult question remained exactly where it had always been. What happened between the last known pieces of Marcia's life and the moment her body was discovered beside Greenlee Road? Because somewhere inside that missing stretch of time, A young woman who had been alive and moving through the world became a homicide victim whose identity would remain unknown for 37 years, and the person responsible disappeared into the same darkness, leaving behind no publicly confirmed explanation for why Marcia was killed or how she came to be in Ohio. The identification in 2018 had therefore created an extraordinary contradiction. The mystery had been solved and unsolved at the same time. The world finally knew the woman behind the Buckskin Girl nickname, yet the central criminal question remained unanswered, and for investigators that meant beginning again, this time with a victim whose history could be traced, a family who could provide context, and a name that could be placed into records that had previously contained only the designation of an unidentified woman. The transformation mattered because every cold case begins with a story that investigators cannot fully see, and the identity of the victim is often the first missing piece. Once that piece is recovered, the rest of the picture can sometimes begin to emerge. But Marcia's case had another complication. Her death had occurred in a different state from the place where she had lived, and that meant the investigation crossed geographical and personal boundaries. The people who knew her best were not necessarily in Ohio, while the people who discovered her body had no reason to know who she was, and those two worlds had remained separate for nearly 4 decades. Investigators had to bridge them, reconstructing the period after Marcia left Arkansas and before her death in Ohio, and that meant looking for evidence of travel, contacts, relationships, and encounters that might explain how she moved across the country. Every detail mattered because the final journey was not simply a trip, it was potentially the path to the killer. And if investigators could establish who had contact with Marcia shortly before her death, the suspect pool could become much smaller. But the difficulty was that the available timeline was incomplete, and the further investigators went backward, the more uncertainty appeared. Cold cases often contain a strange mixture of precise facts and enormous blanks. The date a body was discovered may be certain, the location may be certain, the cause of death may be certain, yet the hours and days before that moment can remain almost entirely unknown, and Marcia's case carried that exact tension. Investigators knew how she died, where she was found, and eventually who she was, but they still needed to determine where she had been immediately before her death, and with whom. The possibility that she had been transported after death remained particularly important because it meant the killer had likely interacted with the body at another location, perhaps leaving behind evidence that investigators had never connected to Marcia because they did not know who she was. This is one of the most frustrating realities of an unidentified victim case. Evidence may exist, but investigators may not know what question to ask of it. An object may seem unrelated. A witness may seem insignificant. A location may appear ordinary, and only after the victim's identity is discovered can those pieces be reconsidered. Suddenly, an old photograph or a forgotten encounter can acquire new significance. Suddenly, investigators can ask whether a particular person knew Marcia, whether a vehicle seen near a location could have transported her, whether a particular place was connected to her movements, and whether someone else's account of the period makes sense when compared with the newly established timeline. That process can reopen investigative doors that appeared permanently closed, but it also requires caution because decades-old memories can be unreliable, and investigators must distinguish between genuine recollection and memory shaped by later exposure to the case. The more famous a cold case becomes, the greater the risk that people unconsciously blend what they remember with what they later learned, which is why corroboration is essential. A witness statement becomes much stronger when it can be supported by another record, another witness, a photograph, a document, or physical evidence. And in Marcia's case, the passage of time makes that corroboration especially important because the investigation cannot rely solely on someone saying they remember something from 1980. It needs to determine whether that memory fits with everything else known about Marcia, the location, and the circumstances of her death. This is where the case becomes less like a mystery story and more like forensic reconstruction. Investigators are not simply searching for a dramatic suspect. They are trying to rebuild a sequence of events from fragments, and each fragment must survive scrutiny. Marcia's identification through genetic genealogy demonstrated the power of scientific reconstruction. but it also demonstrated the limits of what science can answer. Her DNA could establish her biological identity because distant relatives provided the genealogical links necessary to trace her family, but DNA alone could not tell investigators why she was in Ohio or who killed her. Those questions require context, and context comes from people, places, records, and additional evidence. The challenge is that those sources become harder to recover as decades pass. Yet the case remains active precisely because investigators know that new information can still emerge and public awareness can play a major role. Someone who was 20 years old in 1981 may now be in their 60s, 70s, or older, and they may carry memories they have never considered important. Perhaps they knew Marcia briefly. Perhaps they saw her in a town she passed through. Perhaps they remember a woman matching her description. Perhaps they remember a person who was behaving strangely around the time she disappeared. Or perhaps they remember something about the distinctive buckskin jacket, the unusual clothing detail that became so strongly associated with the case. These memories may seem trivial, but cold cases can be solved through trivial details when those details connect to something else. A witness does not have to know the killer's name to provide valuable information. They may only need to provide a missing location in the timeline, and once that location is established, investigators can search for other evidence connected to it. This is why the search for information about Marcia's final journey remains so important, because investigators are effectively trying to build a bridge between her life and her death, and every missing section of that bridge represents an opportunity for the killer to remain hidden. The longer the gap remains, the easier it becomes for theories to multiply, but the harder it becomes to determine which theory is supported by evidence, and responsible investigators must resist the temptation to fill empty spaces simply because the human mind dislikes uncertainty. Sometimes the truth is not the most dramatic possibility, and sometimes a seemingly ordinary explanation can become extraordinary only when the evidence supports it. Marcia's case has already shown why restraint matters, because the story itself is dramatic enough without inventing details. A young woman was murdered. Her body was abandoned beside a road. Her identity remained unknown for 37 years, and then modern genealogy restored her name. The real story does not need a fictional killer, a manufactured motive, or an invented final conversation, because the unanswered reality is powerful enough. Someone killed Marcia King, and that person had not been publicly identified. The absence of that name is not a weakness in the story. It is the heart of the cold case, and it is why investigators continue asking for information. The passage of time has not erased Marcia from the record, and every new generation that learns her name becomes another opportunity for someone to recognize the case, remember something, and contact authorities. The identification also changed the emotional meaning of the original scene, because when investigators first encountered the body, they saw an unidentified woman, but after 2018, they could look at the same evidence, understand that this was Marcia King, a daughter, a young woman from Arkansas, someone whose family had spent years wondering where she had gone. And that realization changes the way the entire investigation is perceived. The roadside was no longer merely the location where a Jane Doe had been found. It was the place where Marcia's life had ended, and the question of who left her there became a question about a real human being rather than an anonymous victim. That distinction matters deeply because anonymity can make a crime seem distant, but a name restores humanity, and Marcia's name has now become inseparable from the demand for answers. Investigators do not need to prove that the case is solvable before they continue investigating. They need to know that evidence remains, that leads can still emerge, and that someone may still hold information capable of changing the investigation. And Marcia's case has already shown that evidence can survive longer than anyone expects. The preserved blood sample survived long enough for genetic technology to transform it into a family connection, and that means the possibility of another breakthrough cannot simply be dismissed. The future may bring improved forensic methods, additional genealogical resources, newly discovered records, or a witness who finally decides to speak. Any of these could change the case, and that possibility is why cold cases remain alive even when decades have passed. But there is something especially haunting about Marcia's story because her identity was recovered only after so much time had already gone by. 37 years of uncertainty. 37 years in which her family did not know exactly where she was or what had happened to her. 37 years in which the investigation could not attach her life to the body found in Ohio, and when the name finally came, it did not bring a complete end. It brought another beginning. Now the question could be asked with precision, not who was the buckskin girl, but who killed Marcia King. That question has survived the identification, survived the scientific breakthrough, and survived the passage of time. And until it is answered, the case remains one of those rare mysteries in which the victim has finally emerged from anonymity while the killer remains hidden behind it. Somewhere there may still be a person who remembers Marcia, someone who knows how she reached Ohio, someone who saw her shortly before her death, someone who remembers a vehicle or a conversation, someone who possesses a detail that has never been connected to the case, and if that detail is ever brought forward, it could become the bridge investigators have been searching for since 1981. The bridge from Marcia's final known movements to the place where her life ended, and beyond that bridge, may be the identity of the person who has remained invisible for more than 4 decades, the person who may have believed that the years would bury the truth. But Marcia's name proves otherwise because the years did not bury her, science found her. Investigators named her, her family remembered her, and now the only thing missing is the final answer, the identity of the person who killed her, and until that answer is found, the case of Marcia King remains open, unresolved, and waiting for someone, somewhere, to remember what happened to the young woman in the buckskin jacket. The longer the search for Marcia King's killer continued, the more the case seemed to become a battle against time itself, because every unanswered year created another layer between investigators and the night when her life ended. Yet the passage of time had already proven that it could not erase everything. The evidence that once seemed incapable of revealing Marcia's identity had survived long enough for modern science to unlock it. And that fact gave investigators a reason to keep looking at the case from different angles, not because they knew a breakthrough was guaranteed, but because the history of the investigation had already demonstrated that yesterday's dead end could become tomorrow's clue. Marcia had spent 37 years as the buckskin girl, a name created by strangers who knew nothing about the woman beneath the clothing. And then genetic genealogy restored her identity, transforming an unidentified body into Marcia Lenore Sossaman King, a 21-year-old woman from Arkansas. But once that name entered the case file, the investigation became more personal and more complicated because every piece of information about Marcia's life raised questions about how she had traveled so far from home and who might have encountered her before she died. Investigators were no longer searching for a missing identity. They were searching for the missing hours and days that separated Marcia's life from her death. And that distinction changed everything. The body had been discovered near Troy, Ohio on April 24, 1981, and investigators believed the location was not necessarily where Marcia had been killed. Her clean, bare feet were among the details that supported the possibility that she had been transported, meaning that somewhere beyond Greenlee Road, there may have been another location connected to the homicide, another place where Marcia had been alive, another place where she may have encountered her killer, and potentially another place where evidence once existed. The possibility of a secondary crime scene is one of the most frustrating challenges in any homicide investigation, because if the original location is never identified, investigators lose an entire layer of context. There may be no witnesses, no obvious physical evidence, and no immediate explanation for how the victim reached the disposal site. But the absence of a known crime scene does not mean the evidence is absent forever. Sometimes the key is not the location itself, the people associated with it, and that is why reconstructing Marcia's movements remains so important. Investigators need to know where she was before her death, because every confirmed location could reveal another person, and every person could potentially provide another piece of the timeline. This is the kind of work that rarely produces dramatic headlines, but it is often the foundation of cold case investigations. Detectives search old records, compare statements, review photographs, examine travel histories when available, and speak with people who may remember the victim. And in a case that is more than 40 years old, even confirming something simple can be difficult because records may have been lost and memories may have changed. Yet there is still value in asking, because one person's memory can lead to another person, and another person can lead to a document, and that document can establish a fact. That changes the entire understanding of the case. Marcia's identification created the possibility of that chain, because before 2018, investigators could not ask the public about Marcia by name. They could only describe the unidentified woman. Now they could ask about a specific person from Arkansas, and that difference could trigger memories that had remained dormant for decades. Someone might have known her, even briefly, without ever realizing that she had become a homicide victim in Ohio. Someone might have crossed paths with her during her travels, and someone might have noticed the distinctive jacket that became the signature of the case. The challenge is that people rarely understand the importance of an ordinary encounter while it is happening. A person who gives a stranger a ride does not expect that stranger to become the subject of a decades-long homicide investigation. And a person who sees someone at a roadside business does not memorize the encounter as potential evidence. That is why cold cases depend so heavily on hindsight, the realization that an ordinary moment may have been connected to something extraordinary. And in Marcia's case, there may still be people who possess exactly that kind of memory, but the investigation must also account for the possibility that some answers have already disappeared. The person who saw Marcia may have died. The person who knew the killer may have moved away, or the person who had information may have taken it to the grave. This is one of the cruel realities of long-term investigation. Investigators are not simply searching through evidence, they are searching through time, and time takes witnesses with it. Yet the case remains significant because Marcia's identity was recovered after such a long period, demonstrating that the disappearance of information is not always permanent. Her blood sample survived, her genetic connections survived, and her family history survived, allowing investigators to reconstruct what had been lost. And that success offers a model for how other parts of the investigation might be approached. Instead of asking whether a clue was useful in 1981, investigators can ask whether it might be useful now. With modern databases, modern forensic techniques, and modern investigative tools, the answer could be different. Technology has transformed homicide investigations in ways that would have been unimaginable when Marcia was killed, and genetic genealogy is perhaps the clearest example. But technology is only one part of the equation. The other part is persistence, because a laboratory can produce a genetic profile, but detectives still have to determine what that profile means. A database can reveal a relationship, but investigators still have to build the family tree, and a family tree can identify a person, but investigators still have to establish whether that person is connected to the crime. Marcia's identification was successful because science and investigation worked together, and the same combination may eventually be necessary to identify her killer. If biological evidence belonging to the offender exists, investigators could potentially use modern techniques to develop or interpret it. But without a publicly confirmed offender profile, the killer remains outside the known narrative, and that uncertainty is precisely why the case cannot be treated as solved. The most responsible conclusion remains simple. Marcia King has been identified, but her murder has not been solved. There is no publicly established identification of the person responsible, and there is no basis for assigning blame to a specific individual without evidence. This restraint can feel frustrating when telling a story designed to create suspense, but it is essential because the real mystery is already powerful enough. A young woman was murdered in 1981. Her body was abandoned beside a rural Ohio road. Her identity remained unknown for 37 years, and then forensic genealogy gave her back her name, while the person responsible remained unidentified. That is the reality, and reality can be more unsettling than fiction because there is no guaranteed ending, no final confession waiting in the next scene, no detective who already knows the answer, only an open question and the possibility that the answer still exists somewhere. Perhaps inside evidence stored in an evidence room, perhaps inside an old document, perhaps inside the memory of someone who has never understood the significance of what they saw, and perhaps inside the genetic traces that modern science has not yet fully interpreted. The case also illustrates the importance of preserving evidence even when a solution seems impossible, because nobody in 1981 could have known that genetic genealogy would eventually transform the investigation. Yet the biological evidence survived, and decades later, it became the foundation for identification. That principle extends beyond Marcia because every unidentified victim represents a possibility that science may eventually provide an answer, and every piece of preserved evidence represents a potential bridge between the past and the future. The story of the buckskin girl therefore became more than a story about an unidentified woman. It became a demonstration of what can happen when investigators refuse to accept that a case is beyond hope. But hope does not mean certainty, and Marcia's family still deserves the second half of the answer. The name of the person responsible for taking her life. That name has not been publicly established, and until it is, the investigation remains unfinished. The identification of Marcia brought dignity and recognition, but justice requires more. It requires an understanding of what happened and accountability for whoever caused her death, and the distance between those two goals is the space where the investigation now lives. Decades after the original crime, the case still depends on the possibility that someone will remember something, that someone will notice a detail that others overlooked, that someone will discover an old photograph or document, that someone will recognize the name Marcia King and suddenly realize they knew her, or that new forensic science will reveal something hidden inside evidence collected more than 40 years ago. Any of those possibilities could change the case, and the fact that such possibilities remain is why investigators continue to encourage information from the public, because sometimes a case does not need hundreds of new clues. It needs one reliable clue, one piece that can connect the scattered fragments into a coherent sequence, one fact that places Marcia somewhere, connects her to someone, or identifies the person who interacted with her shortly before her death. And if that clue exists, it may be closer than anyone realizes, because people often underestimate the value of their own memories, especially memories from decades ago. But Marcia's case has already shown that forgotten things can become important again. The blood sample was old, the family connections were distant, and the original investigation had been unable to identify her. Yet the right technology transformed those fragments into a name. Now the search continues for another transformation, from name to narrative, from narrative to evidence, and from evidence to accountability. Until then, Marcia remains at the center of a case that has already survived more than 40 years. Her name finally known, her story finally visible, but the person responsible for her death still hidden somewhere beyond the edge of the evidence. And that is what makes the case so haunting, because the mystery did not disappear when Marcia was identified. It became sharper, more focused, and more urgent. The question is no longer whether the buckskin girl can be named. She can. Her name is Marcia King. The question is whether the final silence surrounding her death can ever be broken, and whether the person who caused that silence can finally be brought into the light. The search for the person responsible for Marcia King's death had entered a different kind of darkness, because the case no longer lacked a victim's identity. It lacked the final connection between evidence and offender, and that distinction had become more painful with every year that passed. Marcia was no longer the buckskin girl without a name. She was Marcia Lenore Sossaman King, a 21-year-old woman from Arkansas whose life had ended violently in Ohio. And the fact that investigators could finally say her name meant that the investigation had achieved something once considered almost impossible, but it also meant that the remaining mystery stood exposed in its simplest form. Someone killed Marcia. Someone transported her body, someone left her beside that road, and someone knew enough about what happened to remain unidentified for more than 4 decades. The absence of that person's name became the central tension of the case, because everything investigators had learned about Marcia seemed to lead toward the same invisible figure, yet no publicly confirmed evidence had placed a specific individual at the center of the crime, and without that connection, the case remained open. The passage of time had made the investigation more difficult, but it had also created opportunities that investigators in 1981 could never have imagined. Technology had changed, forensic databases had expanded, genetic genealogy had emerged, and investigators had learned to revisit old evidence with questions that previous generations could not ask. Marcia's identification proved the value of that approach, because the preserved blood sample had survived decades and eventually provided enough genetic information to connect her to distant relatives. That discovery did not solve the murder, but it demonstrated something fundamental. The past was still capable of speaking. If investigators knew how to listen, the next challenge was determining whether other surviving evidence could do the same, and that meant reconsidering the original investigation, not necessarily because the detectives had failed to work the case, but because the tools available to them had been dramatically different. Investigators in 1981 were operating without modern DNA profiling, without digital databases capable of cross-referencing millions of records, and without genealogical methods capable of reconstructing family connections from genetic material. They had worked with the evidence available to them, but the limits of that evidence meant the case eventually became cold. Decades later, investigators had a different set of tools, and those tools allowed them to ask new questions, yet technology cannot manufacture evidence, and that reality remains one of the greatest obstacles in an old homicide. If the killer left behind biological evidence that remains usable, modern forensic science might eventually provide a path. But if no suitable biological material exists, investigators must rely on other forms of evidence, and that makes witnesses and historical reconstruction even more important. Marcia's journey from Arkansas to Ohio remains one of the most significant unanswered elements because understanding how she traveled could reveal who had access to her during the period immediately before her death. Investigators have sought information about her movements and anyone who may have encountered her, and every such encounter could become important if it places Marcia somewhere specific at a specific time. A witness might not know who killed her, but they might remember where she was, and that alone could help narrow the timeline. Perhaps Marcia was seen in a town along her route. Perhaps she was traveling with another person. Perhaps she entered a vehicle. Perhaps someone remembers seeing the distinctive buckskin jacket. Perhaps a person remembers meeting a young woman who said she was from Arkansas. Details like these can appear insignificant until investigators place them against the known timeline. Then they can become pieces of a larger picture. The problem is that memories from 40 years ago are not photographs. They change, disappear, and sometimes become mixed with later information, which means investigators must approach them carefully. A witness who genuinely remembers something may still remember the date incorrectly, the location incorrectly, or the identity of another person incorrectly, and that is why corroboration becomes so important. A memory supported by independent evidence becomes much more valuable than a memory standing alone. This is not a story where every recollection can automatically become truth, because the goal is not simply to create a compelling narrative. The goal is to discover what actually happened to Marcia, and that requires separating possibility from proof. The distinction is particularly important because the case has generated public interest for decades, and public interest can produce both valuable leads and false assumptions. People see photographs, read old articles, hear theories, and sometimes begin to remember details that may have been influenced by what they later learned. Investigators must therefore test every claim against the known fact, and they must be willing to discard information that cannot be supported, even when that information seems dramatic. The real story is already extraordinary enough. A 21-year-old woman disappeared from the life her family knew, was murdered in Ohio, remained unidentified for 37 years, and was finally named through genetic genealogy, yet her killer remains unidentified. That reality contains more than enough tension without inventing a suspect. And the absence of an ending is precisely what makes the case so disturbing, because there is no confirmed explanation that allows the story to settle into history. The case remains alive because the central question is still open, and every cold case depends on the possibility that the future may reveal what the past could not. Perhaps a new forensic technique will make old evidence testable. Perhaps a genealogical database will produce an unexpected connection. Perhaps a witness will finally come forward. Perhaps a relative will discover information in an old family archive. Perhaps an investigator will notice a pattern that previous investigators could not see. These possibilities may sound ordinary compared with the dramatic image of a sudden breakthrough, but real cold cases are often solved through exactly these kinds of developments. A single record, a single name, a single biological connection, a single witness who decides that after decades it is finally time to speak. Marcia's case already demonstrated the power of such a moment because her identity remained unknown for 37 years and then was established through a technique that had not even existed when she was killed. The breakthrough did not arrive because the mystery became easier. It arrived because the tools became better. And that distinction matters because it means the future may contain capabilities that investigators do not yet possess. Evidence that cannot be interpreted today may become meaningful tomorrow, and databases that do not exist today may eventually create connections that are impossible now. This is one reason investigators preserve old evidence whenever possible, because the value of evidence can change as science changes. A sample that seems useless can become valuable. A photograph can be digitally enhanced. An old record can be cross-referenced against new information, and a genetic profile can be compared against databases that did not exist when the crime occurred. None of this guarantees a solution, but it creates possibilities, and possibilities are enough to keep a cold case open. For Marcia's family, however, the scientific breakthrough brought complicated emotions because the identification ended one kind of uncertainty while confirming another. For 37 years, they did not know exactly what had happened to Marcia, and now they knew that she had been murdered. They could finally place her life into the historical record. But they still lack the name of the person responsible, and that is a difficult kind of knowledge. The uncertainty is gone. But justice remains incomplete. Her family can remember her by name now, and the public can tell her story accurately, but the unanswered question still hangs over the case, and that question has a human face, even if the killer does not. It is the face of a 21-year-old woman whose life should have continued far beyond 1981, a woman whose future was taken from her and whose family spent decades without knowing where she had gone. The identification, therefore, matters not simply because it solved a forensic puzzle, but because it restored the person at the center of the story. Marcia was not a nickname, not a case number, not a forensic sketch, and not simply a body found beside a road. She was Marcia King, and that name carries everything. The unidentified designation could not. Now the investigation must carry that name forward, asking who encountered her, who knew her, who may have traveled with her, and who may have seen something during the final chapter of her life, because somewhere inside those answers may be the key to identifying the person responsible. The investigation does not require a complete memory from one person. It may require several partial memories that can be combined. One person remembers a location, another remembers a vehicle, another remembers a conversation, another remembers seeing Marcia, and investigators compare those accounts until a pattern emerges. That process can take time, especially when the original events occurred more than 40 years ago. But time does not automatically make information worthless. Sometimes it makes a previously insignificant detail more valuable because investigators now understand what they are looking for. The buckskin jacket is a perfect example of how a single detail can become part of the public memory of a case. But the ultimate goal is not to preserve a legend. It is to reconstruct reality, and that means continuing to ask questions even when the answers are uncomfortable or incomplete. The most difficult question may be whether the killer is still alive, because after more than 4 decades, there is no guarantee that the person responsible remains available for prosecution. But investigators cannot know that without identifying the individual, and therefore the search must continue regardless. If the offender has died, evidence may still reveal his identity, and if he is alive, the possibility of accountability remains. But speculation about either possibility does nothing to solve the case. Only evidence can do that, and evidence is precisely what investigators continue to seek. Marcia's story has already shown that evidence can survive longer than expected, and that science can recover information from places where investigators once saw only uncertainty. So the case remains more than a historical mystery. It remains an active search for truth, and every new generation of investigators inherits not only the unresolved questions, but also the lessons of the past. The most important lesson is perhaps the simplest. Never assume that an old case is beyond hope, because the technology available tomorrow may reveal what the technology available today cannot. Marcia King's identity was once considered inaccessible, yet 37 years later it was recovered, and that means the remaining mystery, while difficult, is not necessarily permanent. Somewhere there may be a clue that has not yet been understood, a witness who has not yet spoken, or a connection that has not yet been made. And until those possibilities are exhausted, the story of Marcia King cannot truly end. Her name has survived, her family's search has been recognized, and her murder remains an open question, waiting for the next person to look at the evidence and ask something nobody asked before, waiting for the next witness to remember something nobody remembered before, waiting for the next scientific breakthrough to reveal something hidden inside evidence collected decades ago, and waiting, above all, for the silence surrounding the person responsible to finally break. The silence around Marcia King had lasted so long that it almost seemed to have become part of the case itself, an invisible wall separating investigators from the person who knew what happened. But silence is not the same as disappearance, and somewhere behind that silence could still be information capable of changing the entire investigation, because the person responsible for Marcia's death did not erase the past, only the connection between the past and the truth. And that connection was precisely what investigators continued trying to rebuild year after year, evidence after evidence, memory after memory. The story began with a young woman whose identity was hidden for decades, but once genetic genealogy restored her name, investigators were able to approach the case from a new direction. They could stop asking who the unidentified woman was and begin asking what had happened to Marcia King, where she had gone, who she had met, and what circumstances had brought her to Ohio. Every question pointed toward the same critical period, the final days of her life, a period that remained incomplete and therefore potentially decisive, because if investigators could reconstruct even part of that timeline, they might discover a person who had crossed paths with Marcia shortly before her death, and that person could become an important witness, a source of information, or potentially someone connected to the homicide. But reconstructing a timeline from 1981 was like trying to rebuild a shattered clock after 40 years. Some pieces were still visible, others were missing, and some had been altered by time. Investigators could rely on established facts, but between those facts were gaps that had to be approached carefully. The body was found near Troy, Ohio, on April 24, 1981, and the circumstances indicated that Marcia had been killed before being left there. But what happened immediately before that moment remained unclear. The possibility that she had been transported after death meant the killer may have driven her from another location. And if so, the vehicle, route, and destination could potentially hold clues, but decades later, identifying that route would be extraordinarily difficult, especially without a witness who had seen the journey. Still, investigators had something they had not possessed before: Marcia's identity. And identity changes the meaning of every investigation because it allows detectives to connect physical evidence to a real history, to a real family, to real relationships, and to real places. A person who had once been a Jane Doe could now be traced through records, photographs, relatives, and memory, and every new piece of information could be compared against the circumstances of her death. This is the point where the investigation became more than an effort to identify an unknown victim. It became an effort to reconstruct a life and locate the moment when that life intersected with the person responsible for ending it. The search for that intersection was complicated by the fact that Marcia had traveled far from Arkansas, and the reasons for that journey were not fully established. Investigators, therefore, had to examine her movements without assuming a motive, because travel itself does not explain a homicide, and a responsible investigation cannot turn uncertainty into accusation. There are countless reasons why a young person might travel across state lines, and only evidence can establish which circumstances applied to Marcia. The danger in a cold case is that unanswered questions create an irresistible temptation to fill them with theory. But theories do not solve murders. Evidence does, and the evidence must be strong enough to survive scrutiny, especially when the passage of time has made definitive answers more difficult. This is why the investigation continues to focus on what can be verified, because one confirmed fact can be more valuable than dozens of speculative possibilities. A confirmed sighting of Marcia, a documented movement, an identified acquaintance, a preserved record, or a piece of physical evidence can narrow the field in ways that speculation never can, and the possibility that such information still exists is what keeps the case alive. Perhaps someone remembers Marcia from the period shortly before her death. Perhaps someone recalls seeing the distinctive buckskin jacket. Perhaps someone remembers a young woman traveling through an area and speaking with a stranger. Perhaps someone remembers a vehicle connected to an encounter. Or perhaps someone has an old photograph in which Marcia appears without anyone realizing it. These possibilities may seem remote, but cold cases are often solved because one person suddenly recognizes a connection that had been invisible before. The identification of Marcia created exactly that opportunity, because people who once might have dismissed the unidentified woman as unrelated to their memories can now compare the case to someone they actually knew. And the power of a name should not be underestimated. A name can trigger recognition. Recognition can trigger memory, and memory can lead to evidence. Yet even with this advantage, investigators still face the brutal reality that more than 4 decades have passed, and some memories may be gone forever. Witnesses who were young adults in 1981 may now be elderly, and people who knew Marcia may have moved across the country, changed their names, lost contact with old friends, or died without ever knowing that she had become a homicide victim. That means the investigation must move quickly whenever new information appears, because the window for recovering human memory becomes smaller with every year. Physical evidence, however, does not experience time in quite the same way. When properly preserved, it can remain available for future testing, and Marcia's case proved that biological evidence could remain valuable decades later. The blood sample collected in 1981 ultimately became the key to identifying her, something that would have seemed impossible to investigators at the time. And that scientific breakthrough is one of the most important reasons the case continues to matter. It demonstrates that an old evidence room can't contain the future of an investigation. A sample can sit untouched for decades and suddenly become the most important object in the case when technology catches up with it. But investigators cannot simply wait for science to solve everything, because science requires material, and material requires preservation, collection, documentation, and careful analysis, which means the work done at the original crime scene remains important even today. The investigators of 1981 may not have known what future scientists would need, but the fact that evidence was collected and preserved gave later investigators an opportunity, and that opportunity eventually produced Marcia's identity. The same principle applies to any surviving evidence related to the homicide. If a useful trace remains, it may someday provide information that investigators cannot extract from it today. Modern forensic science continues to evolve, and future technique may become even more sensitive and precise, but no responsible investigator can promise that a future test will produce an answer. The possibility is enough to justify preservation, not certainty, and that distinction is crucial because cold case investigations are built on possibility combined with discipline, not hope alone. Marcia's case also carries another important lesson. Solving one mystery does not necessarily solve the entire case. The genetic genealogy breakthrough answered the question of identity, but it did not establish the killer, and investigators must resist the natural desire to treat a major breakthrough as a final end. Instead, the identification became a doorway, opening access to information that had been inaccessible for 37 years. The next task was to walk through that doorway and reconstruct the circumstances of Marcia's final day, and that remains the central investigative challenge, because somewhere between the life she left behind and the roadside where she was found is the missing story, and the missing story may contain the name of the offender. Investigators are therefore interested in anyone who knew Marcia, anyone who encountered her, anyone who may have traveled with her, and anyone who may have information about how she reached Ohio. but public appeals must be handled carefully because they are not invitations to accuse people based on suspicion. They are requests for information, and information must be evaluated through evidence. The goal is not to find a convenient suspect. It is to find the truth. Even if the truth turns out to be more complicated than investigators expect, perhaps the offender was someone Marcia knew, perhaps someone she encountered briefly, perhaps someone who had no connection to her before that final meeting. The available facts do not establish the answer, and until they do, the identity remains unknown. This uncertainty can be frustrating, especially for audiences who expect every cold case story to end with an arrest. But real investigations do not follow television timelines. Sometimes decades pass without a decisive breakthrough, and sometimes a breakthrough arrives from the most unexpected source. Marcia's identification itself was once unimaginable, yet it happened because investigators combined genetic science with genealogy and persistence, and that achievement changed the trajectory of the case. Now the investigation stands before another barrier, and the question is whether modern science and human memory can break through it, if a biological trace connected to the killer can be developed, if a witness can place Marcia with a particular person, if an old record can reveal a previously unknown connection, or if a new genealogical lead emerged. The case could move rapidly, but until such evidence appears, the responsible conclusion remains unchanged. Marcia King's murder is unsolved, the offender has not been publicly identified, and the circumstances of her final journey remain incomplete. Yet the case is not forgotten. Because her name is now known, her story can be told, and the evidence remains part of an investigation that has already demonstrated the power of persistence. Perhaps that is why the image of the buckskin girl remains so haunting, not because she is still unknown, but because she is finally known and still does not have justice. The world once knew only the jacket, the roadside, and the unidentified body. Now the world knows Marcia, and knowing her name makes the unanswered question even sharper. Who was the last person to see her alive? Who knew where she was going? Who knew how she arrived in Ohio? And who knew enough about her death to remain silent? Those questions have survived for more than 40 years, but they have not become less important with age. If anything, the passage of time has made the answers more urgent, because every surviving witness, every preserved record, and every remaining piece of evidence represents a shrinking opportunity, and somewhere within those remaining fragments may be the one connection investigators have been missing, the connection that transforms Marcia King from an identified victim into the center of a solved homicide. Until then, her story remains suspended between discovery and justice, between the name that science recovered and the name that investigators still cannot give, and that final silence continues to echo from the Ohio roadside where the mystery began, a mystery that survived 37 years without a name, survived the limitations of old forensic science, survived the passage of generations, and now waits for the one piece of evidence that could finally reveal who was responsible for taking Marcia King's life. The search for Marcia King's killer had reached the point where every surviving fact carried extraordinary weight, because there were no longer decades of uncertainty about who the victim was, only the far more difficult question of who had taken her life, and that question had become sharper rather than soft. After the 2018 identification, when genetic genealogy finally transformed the buckskin girl from an unidentified homicide victim into Marcia Lenore Sossaman King, a 21-year-old woman from Arkansas, the breakthrough was historic. But it was never the end of the investigation. It was the moment the investigation could finally begin asking more precise questions, and one of those questions was unavoidable. Who had been with Marcia during the final chapter of her life? Because investigators believed she had likely been killed somewhere other than the place where her body was discovered, and that possibility meant the roadside near Troy might have been only the final location in a much longer sequence of events. A place chosen to conceal a body rather than a place chosen for a murder. The distinction mattered enormously, because if Marcia had been transported after her death, then someone had moved her. Someone had access to a vehicle or another means of transportation. Someone had selected the location, and someone had believed that leaving her there would delay or prevent identification, and for decades that strategy appeared to work. The young woman had no identification on her. Her family did not know where she was, and investigators had no name to attach to the body. But the killer had underestimated one thing. Time could preserve evidence, and science could eventually change what that evidence meant. The preserved blood sample became the foundation of the genetic genealogy investigation, and the genetic information eventually led investigators to relatives who could help establish Marcia's identity. According to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, law enforcement uploaded her DNA to GEDmatch and found a strong potential extended relative, ultimately leading investigators toward her family and confirming that the woman found in Ohio was Marcia King. That moment changed the case forever, but it also exposed how much remained unknown, because identifying Marcia did not reveal the person who killed her, it revealed the victim's identity. And those are two completely different investigative problems. The first can sometimes be solved through family genetics, while the second requires a connection between the offender and the crime, and that connection still had not been publicly established. Investigators therefore had to return to the original evidence and ask a different question. Not who is this woman, but what can everything we know about her tell us about the person who crossed paths with her? The first step was understanding the circumstances surrounding her death, and those circumstances were disturbing. Marcia had suffered fatal injuries and was found fully dressed, but without shoes or socks, while the distinctive buckskin poncho she wore became the reason she was known for decades as the Buckskin Girl. The condition of her feet was particularly significant because investigators believed the cleanliness suggested she had not walked through the area where she was discovered, reinforcing the possibility that she had been transported there after being killed. While Interstate 75 was only a few miles away, making the location accessible to someone traveling through the region, but accessibility alone could not identify the offender. It could only establish a possibility, and that distinction had to remain clear because over the years, investigators and the public considered different theories about who might have killed Marcia, including possible connections to other murders. But those theories were not established as fact, and one previously suggested connection to the so-called redhead murders was ultimately rejected, meaning that the case could not responsibly be solved by attaching Marcia to another series simply because similarities existed. The same caution applied to theories involving strangers, truck drivers, acquaintances, or people from Marcia's past. Without evidence, each remained a possibility rather than an answer, and the investigation had to resist the pressure to turn uncertainty into certainty. That is one of the hardest parts of a cold case, because the human mind wants a villain, wants a motive, wants a sequence of events that makes sense. But a homicide investigation cannot operate on what feels convincing. It must operate on what can be demonstrated. And Marcia's case contained an enormous number of questions that could not yet be demonstrated. Where exactly had she been before her death? How had she traveled from Arkansas? Who had she met? Who had she trusted? Who had seen her last? And where had the fatal attack occurred? Each question represented a missing piece, but together they formed the outline of the unknown period that investigators needed to reconstruct. And the more precisely that period could be reconstructed, the smaller the universe of possible offenders might become. That is why the identification of Marcia was so important, because before 2018, investigators could not fully investigate her history through the lens of a known identity. But after 2018, they could connect her to relatives, records, photographs, and the life she had lived before becoming an unidentified victim. The case could finally move backward from the roadside, from the crime scene, toward the woman who had existed before all of it. And that journey backward was essential, because a victim's life often contains the context that a crime scene cannot provide, not necessarily a motive for the killer, but information about movements, relationships, destinations, and contacts. And Marcia's life had taken her far from Arkansas, meaning the investigation had to look beyond Ohio, beyond the immediate location where she was found, and beyond the assumption that the person responsible necessarily lived nearby. Someone could have encountered Marcia while traveling, someone could have transported her across state lines, or someone could have met her only shortly before the murder, and without a complete timeline. There was no responsible way to determine which possibility was correct. The search, therefore, depended on information from people who might remember her, And that is where the passage of time created perhaps the greatest obstacle, because anyone who knew Marcia in 1980 or 1981 had lived more than 40 years since those events. Some would have moved, some would have changed careers, some would have lost touch with old friends, and some would no longer be alive. Even those who remained might remember only fragments, but fragments can matter, especially when investigators are rebuilding a timeline. A person might remember seeing a young woman wearing a distinctive jacket. Another might remember a conversation. Another might remember a vehicle. And another might remember an unfamiliar traveler passing through a particular location. None of those details alone would solve the case. But if several could be independently connected, they might establish a sequence that investigators could test against the physical evidence. This is how the reconstruction of an old case can begin, not with a dramatic confession, but with small facts that suddenly Aileen and the Marcia King investigation had already proven that alignment could produce extraordinary results, because the genetic genealogy process itself depended on finding relationships that were distant, incomplete, and initially separated by generations. Investigators and genealogists had to build connections until the identity emerged, and the same patience is required when reconstructing a murder, except now the desired answer is not a family relationship, but a criminal connection. The evidence must show more than that. Someone knew Marcia. It must establish relevance to her death. And that is why investigators cannot simply accuse someone based on proximity, rumor, or speculation. A person may have known Marcia without having anything to do with her murder, and a person who never knew her could still have encountered her during her final journey. The possibilities remain broad, and only evidence can narrow them. Yet the passage of time has not erased every opportunity, because the original investigation produced photographs, reports, forensic findings, and preserved material, and modern investigators can compare those older records with information that became available only after Marcia's identity was established. This process can reveal inconsistencies, overlook connections, or details that had little meaning when the victim was unidentified but become significant once her background is known. The difference between those two eras is enormous. In 1981, investigators were looking at an unknown young woman. In 2018 and afterward, they could look at Marcia King, and that meant every question could be reframed. Perhaps an old witness statement could be reviewed with new information. Perhaps a location once considered irrelevant could become important. Perhaps a person mentioned only in passing could be researched further. Perhaps an old photograph could reveal someone standing near Marcia who had never previously been recognized. None of these possibilities should be presented as established facts unless evidence confirms them, but each illustrates why identification can transform a cold case. The identity gives investigators a framework, and a framework gives meaning to fragments. Yet even with that framework, the central question remains unanswered, and that is why the case continues to carry such emotional force. Marcia's family had waited decades for the basic truth that she had not simply disappeared, she had been murdered, and then they received her name back, a name that had been absent from the case for 37 years, but the discovery created another painful reality. Someone responsible for her death remained unidentified, and the possibility of never knowing that person's name meant the family's journey toward closure was incomplete. The case therefore stands at a strange intersection between triumph and frustration. Science achieved what once seemed impossible, but science did not achieve everything. Genetic genealogy gave investigators Marcia's identity, but the murder still requires traditional investigative work, forensic analysis, witness development, and evidence strong enough to establish responsibility. The scientific breakthrough opened the door. But someone still has to walk through it, and that someone may ultimately be a detective, a forensic scientist, a genealogist, a witness, or even an ordinary person who recognizes something in Marcia's story and realizes that a memory they have carried for decades may matter. That possibility is what keeps the investigation alive, because there is no guarantee that the final clue will come from the place investigators expect. It may come from a forgotten document, an old photograph, a preserved biological trace, or a person who has never before connected their memory to the buckskin girl, and that is why Marcia's name must remain attached to the story, because names are what allow memories to return. The unidentified woman could be forgotten by someone who encountered her, but Marcia King is a person with a history, a family, and a face, and when that name reaches someone who once knew her, it may trigger recognition that the old, unidentified case could finally explain something they have carried without. Understanding more than 4 decades have passed since Marcia's body was discovered, yet the investigation has not disappeared because the most important breakthrough came after 37 years, proving that time does not always close a case. Sometimes it changes the tools available to investigators, and sometimes it changes the questions they are able to ask. Marcia's identity is no longer a mystery, but the person responsible for her death remains hidden, and until that final connection is established, the story cannot have the ending that her family deserves, because the world now knows who the victim was, and that knowledge makes the remaining silence even louder. Somewhere beyond the evidence already understood may be the answer. Somewhere inside the missing timeline may be the name investigators need, and somewhere in the memories of people who lived through that period may be the detail that finally connects Marcia's last journey to the person who ended it. The question remains open, the evidence remains important, and the search continues because Marcia King waited 37 years to be identified, and after finally getting her name back, she should not be allowed to disappear into silence again.